Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. The Wind and the Eagle Wings at Hogwarts. Chapter 1. This day is the annual enrollment day for new students at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the only magic school in England. For the little wizards who are studying at Hogwarts or about to go to Hogwarts, taking the train from King's Cross Station is the only way to get to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. This caused the entire platform to be crowded with people, which was particularly lively. Students of different ages and parents who saw them off pushed large and small bags of luggage on the platform. Owls flew over people's heads, dropping a few feathers. Several cats were flexibly shuttling under people's feet. Next to the platform, a crimson steam locomotive was parked there. The sign on the train read Hogwarts Express, 11 o'clock. In a quiet carriage near the end of the train, a boy sat alone in a compartment, holding his chin and looking at the crowded crowd outside the window. He has slightly curly but not messy black hair, just like his clothes, giving people the first impression of being fresh and neat. He wore a plain wizard robe with a blue badge embroidered on his chest. In addition to a bronze eagle, there was also the word Ravenclaw on the badge. At this time, although he was looking out the window, the noisy scenes were not reflected in his transparent blue eyes, and his thoughts were flying. Scott Trollope, born in an ordinary family in Hastings, a small port town in southeast England, is 14 years old and a fourth-year student at the Ravenclaw College of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. In addition to these, he has a secret identity that is different from ordinary people, a time traveler. It has been 14 years since he was reborn in this world with the memory of his previous life. Scott didn't know why he was reborn in this world with his memory after his accidental death in his previous life. He could only sigh that everything in his previous life could not be traced. In this life, his growth experience before the age of 11 can also be called unremarkable. He was not a well-known child prodigy, nor the richest man in the world. He did not rush to publish the Harry Potter novel, nor did he buy Apple stocks, nor did he learn hacking skills to empty the Bank of England. He did not even have the standard system for time travelers. He just accepted his new identity quickly after his brain was fully developed and he could think independently in infancy, and then grew up step by step. The first time he noticed the abnormality was of course because of the sudden magic riot. There is no need to elaborate on the process at that time. Anyway, after that, he quickly accepted another new identity of his own, probably a little wizard. He did not think that he was a mutant or awakened by superpowers. The feeling of magic riot was so clear, and this was England, so of course he would choose the most likely one among the many options that could explain the magic riot. After he received the admission letter from Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry when he was 11 years old, his parents, Michael and Amelia, also readily accepted this fact. They didn't make a fuss, nor did they regard their wizard son as an outlier. It should be emphasized that the Trollope family is a pure Muggle family. Michael and Amelia run an antique shop together. There are no wizards or squibs among their relatives or friends, and there are no hidden secret rooms or magical portraits in the house. After Scott confirmed his guess about this world, he just felt a little sorry that he only had a brief outline of the story of Harry Potter, but he did not feel anxious about it. He was not a fan of the Harry Potter series of novels and movies. In his previous life, he just read the entire series of novels one after another in his student days. Even for the series of adapted movies that are popular all over the world, he only watched the first two when he was still young. But he felt that he was lucky to still remember the outline, and he should smile at his outstanding memory. After all, it was amazing to still remember the general outline of the whole story after reincarnation after many years. In short, Scott boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time in 1989 when he was 11 years old, and was sorted into Ravenclaw by the sorting hat at the sorting ceremony. He originally thought that his easygoing personality would be sorted into Hufflepuff by the sorting hat. But he didn't expect that the sorting hat could see that his intelligence was obviously more prominent than his easygoing personality. It should be emphasized that Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry does not have legitimacy for young wizards. Neither the sorting hat nor Headmaster Dumbledore are obviously interested in the mediocre memory in the young wizard's mind. Scott believes that they can easily judge a person's ability and character, so memory is not that important. He knows that as long as he is a student who is not too out of line in school, no one will pay special attention to him. On the contrary, if he is always suspicious and shows a strong sense of defense, he will be suspected of, there is nothing wrong here. Everything was just as he thought. Since entering the magical school life, Scott has safely spent 3 years as a wizard apprentice. Woohoo! The long whistle interrupted his thoughts, and the train started. Scott came back to his senses, looked at the scenery that was constantly going away outside the window for a while, and then took out a book with a colorful cover from the backpack beside him. Holiday with the Hag, written by Gilderoy Lockhart. Lockhart was a person that Scott still had some impression of in his memory, and he was also the professor who was responsible for teaching them the defense against the dark arts class in this new school year. Scott still remembered that he was a liar who was seeking fame and reputation. The plots in his book were stolen by casting memory spells on the real owners of those adventures. However, although Lockhart was a fake, Scott felt that his book was still worth reading. After all, except for the name of the protagonist in the book, the adventures themselves were all true. Otherwise, Lockhart would not have been able to obtain the honors that made him famous with these novels. The train sped across the field, and Scott turned the pages of the book from time to time. He did not read it very carefully, but just glanced through it quickly, and then took a pen to mark the really useful knowledge in the book. Of course, he skipped all the paragraphs that Lockhart used to brag about himself. When he was halfway through the book, he suddenly put down his pen and turned his head to look at the door of the compartment. 5 seconds later, the door of the compartment was opened. "Excuse me." The little witch who was pulling the door stuck her head into the compartment and asked hurriedly, "Have you seen Harry Potter and Ron Weasley today?" Scott saw that she had thick brown hair and a pair of big front teeth. He knew this girl, the little partner of Savior, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger. The girl probably didn't expect that Scott was looking at the door before she opened the door, which caused her to meet his gaze as soon as she opened the door. She pursed her lips in embarrassment under Scott's gaze, held the door with her hands, and stood up straighter. "Harry Potter and Ron Weasley." Scott spoke a little slowly and his voice was a little deep. He has not yet left the stage of voice change. In order to prevent his voice from breaking and causing embarrassment, he always subconsciously slows down his speech speed and lowers his voice. "Sorry, I didn't see those two gentlemen, Miss Granger." He shook his head at Hermione Granger and answered her politely. Of course, he actually knew that the two boys should be flying in the sky in a car. "Oh, thank you." Hermione Granger thanked him quickly and glanced at the book in his hand, Holidays with a Dominatrix. On the cover of the book, a picture of Gerald Lockhart gives her a goofy, charming smile. Scott was a little surprised to see that she didn't leave. He asked, "Is there anything else you can do, Miss Granger?" The little witch raised her eyebrows and spoke very quickly. "Were you reading Holiday with a Dominatrix just now? I need to apologize to you for disturbing your wonderful reading time, but I haven't yet know your name." "Oh, by the way, you know me." Scott chuckled softly. "Of course I know you, Granger, who defended the Philosopher's Stone with the Savior, Mr. Potter, in the last school year, and contributed 50 points to Gryffindor's House Cup at the end of the dinner. Miss, by the way, Scott Trollope, Ravenclaw, about to enter his 4th year." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Trollope. And I'm really sorry for interrupting your reading." Hermione Granger still spoke at a very fast speed. Scott was about to say goodbye to her, but he didn't expect that her words hadn't ended yet. "Of course, I've read that book. It's really good. I mean, Professor Lockhart's books are amazing. They're just great. This year's Defense Against the Dark Arts class is really exciting, isn't it? See you at Hogwarts." After quickly saying these long words, she exited the cubicle, closed the door and left in a hurry. What a fiery girl. Scott shook his head, then fell into thought. He reviewed the general plot of this school year in his mind. The diary of one of Voldemort's 7 Horcruxes would control Ginny Weasley, the youngest daughter of the Weasley family, to open Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets and release one of the Basilisk's attacks Muggle-born students. This plot was extremely unfriendly to him, a young wizard born as a Muggle. Because he couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't encounter a deadly basilisk in the school corridor one day. It seems that this school year can't go by as it should be, Scott, who has been doing it for 3 years, thought. During the summer vacation, he thought about many plans for this plot, and finally formulated a plan that was generally safe and feasible. It was impossible to take risks, and he wanted to nip danger in the bud while ensuring his own safety. At this time, he reviewed his plan again, then relaxed, took out his pocket watch from his robe pocket and checked the time. It was 12:43 noon, more than an hour had passed since the train started. He was going to take out the lunch he had brought to fill his stomach. But just as he opened his backpack, he suddenly stopped and turned to look at the door of the compartment. After another 5 seconds, the door of the compartment was opened again. "So you're here, Scott." The tall, muscular boy poked his head in and took a look, then strode into the booth and sat on the seat opposite Scott. "Hey, Roger." Scott took out the paper bag containing the hamburger from his backpack and asked in surprise, "Why are you here?" "I thought you would be with your current girlfriend, that Hufflepuff, Miss Mill." Quote. Roger Davis, a Ravenclaw student in the same grade as Scott, is also his roommate who lives in the same dormitory. Mill. Roger grinned at Scott. "She and I have broken up." When Scott heard the news, he just paused the movements of his hands for a second, a moment of silence for himself who was trying to remember Miss Mill, and then asked casually, "When did this happen again?" Roger said with a smile, "The days after the final exam last school year." Scott glanced at Roger calmly and said nothing. Roger has added a new page to his rich love history, but he has no interest in making any comments. "Are you not curious at all about the reason why I broke up?" Roger took advantage of Coster to open the paper bag and grab a hamburger from inside. "Trust me, Roger." Scott handed Roger a bottle of Coke. "If you have an extremely philandering roommate like me, you will definitely get used to it after 3 years and completely lose interest in his love experience. I guess even Eddie has no interest in spreading this kind of excess." Frequent love news. Etika Mitchell, their roommate, this boy who entered school a year later than them, is usually very keen on spreading all kinds of gossip. Roger shrugged, chewing a burger in his mouth, and said vaguely, "From what you said, it seems that your playboy roommate is a very bad guy." Scott gave Roger a slightly exaggerated fake smile and said, "He is a good roommate to me. His philandering has nothing to do with me. After all, those girls he dumped are not familiar with me, and I won't fall in love with him." Okay. Roger took this as a compliment. He happily opened the cap of the Coke bottle and raised the Coke bottle towards Scott. "Cheers to my roommate. Cheers to my roommate." Scott raised the unopened Coke bottle and touched it with him. Roger didn't care. He just stared at Scott and smiled strangely, winking at him, and asked, "The girl who just left this cubicle is the Gryffindor's savior, Potter's friend, Miss Know-It-All, right? How did you know each other?" Scott glanced at him unhappily, swallowed the food in his mouth and said, "We just met. She asked me if I saw her friends Potter and Weasley. Those 2 boys may not have caught the train." "Why didn't she ask you?" "Maybe because I missed it when I went to the toilet." Roger thought this news was very interesting. He smiled and said, "There was a problem on the first day of the new school year. You were really worthy of being the savior." Scott thought to himself, it's just a short time since the beginning. The savior always needs to go through hardships to defeat the big devil and save the world, right? At this time, Roger saw the book, Holiday with the Hag, that Scott placed on the seat beside him. He asked Scott curiously, "You actually read this kind of novel?" "Novel?" Scott deliberately raised his eyebrows and looked at him questioningly. "This is the textbook for the Defense Against the Dark Arts class in the new school year." "Hey," Roger said angrily, "are you also fascinated by Lockhart's sparkling smirk? Although the photo on the cover is silly, there is some knowledge in the book that is worth reading." Scott gave an objective evaluation. Roger began to complain. "You know, I have a hunch that Lockhart's teaching level may even be worse than Quirrell. He is more of a star than a professor. To be honest, I really don't understand why Dumbledore we always find weird people to teach defense against the dark arts, so we almost have to rely on self-study in this subject to cope with the exams." He had obviously lost faith in defense against the dark arts lessons in the new school year. Scott thought for a while and guessed, there should be almost no wizards taking the initiative to apply for this position. After all, judging from past history, the curse on this course should be true, which has led to many male and female wizards except Snape. After all, the Defense Against the Dark Arts class at Hogwarts has changed professors every year for decades, and many professors who have served in this class have ended badly. This fact is well known in the British wizarding world. This is the only possible reason why Lockhart could become a professor. Roger reluctantly accepted the answer. If it were Snape. He followed Scott's words and began to imagine. If Snape successfully applies for the position of Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts, then the most likely possibility is that he will leave Hogwarts completely after 1 year. Ask me, why doesn't Dumbledore just agree to his request? Roger had been sprayed with venom by Snape in previous potions classes, so now just imagining the possibility of Snape leaving Hogwarts made him so excited that he couldn't help himself. That's obviously impossible. Scott ruthlessly shattered his delusion. Dumbledore will not make Snape expendable in that position. Although Snape's teaching method in potions class is difficult to adapt to, he is a precious potions master after all. I know, Roger said dejectedly, so I can only think about it. The two of them ate all the food Scott brought while chatting. So you came to me specifically to help me consume food, Roger? Scott bags the trash. No, Roger said, I came to ask you if you want to participate in the selection of the Quidditch Academy team. After all, you know, we have another player graduating. No need. I hope you still remember that I participated with you when I was in 2nd grade. It's a pity that I failed. Scott put the trash aside and declined Roger's offer. But you are still interested in Quidditch, right? And you are talented. Remember, Scott, you were very accurate when you participated in the selection in the 2nd grade. He whispered a little, it's just that in the I fell short in flying. When it came to the topic of Quidditch, Roger was as excited as most little wizards. He is looking forward to playing with his friends. Listen, our team is short of a chaser right now. I think you can try it, and I think you will succeed this time. Scott still shook his head. Sorry, Roger, you know, after the 1st grade flying lessons, I didn't have the opportunity to practice and improve my ability to control a broomstick. He was well aware that his ability to fly was not enough to allow him to compete in an exciting Quidditch match. This is not surprising. Young wizards born from Muggle families are indeed inferior to those born from wizarding families in the art of flying. Unless you have Harry Potter's incredible flying talent. Little wizards who come from wizarding families start riding toy broomsticks when they can't walk. Little wizards who are born as Muggles don't get into contact with them for the first time until they enter school at the age of 11, and they don't have many opportunities except for 1st grade flying lessons, practice. As for Scott's flying talent, it can only be said to be mediocre. Although he could improve through continuous practice, his interest in Quidditch was not that great. However, Roger didn't seem to listen to his words. He still persuaded. Are you going to spend all your time studying like last school year? Oh, that's too bad. You should realize that even if we are Ravenclaw doesn't mean that we don't need to have fun after studying. Stop. Scott raised his hand to tell Roger to stop chattering. I know you want me to play with you, Roger, he said, but you're obviously overly optimistic about your roommate's ability. But Roger insisted. I think you can do it. You are always so smart, Scott. You know, I didn't persuade Milton to participate in Quidditch. Milton Graves, another roommate of the two, is a sentimental and artistic boy whose biggest hobby is playing the cello. It's such an honor. Compared with Milton, I am indeed very good. Scott smirked again. You know, the final evaluation Milton received in his 1st grade flying class was dreadful. The evaluation Scott received was acceptable passing. Seeing Scott's firm attitude, Roger could only say reluctantly, well, your own wishes are the most important. After all, if Scott's flying has not improved as he said, he will not be able to pass the selection. Roger encouraged Scott to participate in the selection in order to let Scott and him serve as the team's chaser. Because he felt that Scott, as his best friend, would show him a tacit understanding that others did not have in the game. But his hope seemed to be dashed. But I have to say that even in Ravenclaw, you are the one who is most obsessed with learning, Scott. Roger let go of the topic of Quidditch and said with a somewhat exaggerated expression, especially last school year, you were completely immersed in your wood and stone, and you didn't even sit in the audience seats during the Quidditch game. Although Scott's flying talent was mediocre and he was not selected in the Quidditch team selection in the 2nd year, he also had his own strengths. Since entering the 1st year, although his performance in most of the courses set by the school was not top-notch, but the level that was neither outstanding nor bad, he performed very well in the Transfiguration class. The professor of this course was Minerva McGonagall, the vice principal of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and the dean of Gryffindor College. This is a professor who is very strict with students. But even she couldn't help but smile and praise Scott, praising him for his superb talent in the subject of transfiguration. Scott felt that since he had this talent, he should work hard to give full play to his advantages. So Scott has been studying and experimenting with transfiguration-related topics in his spare time. The last school year was a critical period for his research. In order to get visible and beautiful results, he always rushed into it, so he missed a lot of activities. Roger's expression at this time was as if Scott had done something unforgivable if he didn't go to watch the Quidditch game. "Oh, thank you for reminding me." Scott could only smile and say, "I think I will have an easier time in the new school year. At least I will have time to watch your Quidditch game." The journey from London to Hogwarts was a bit long, and Coster and Roger didn't talk for long, and then they fell asleep leaning on their seats. When Scott woke up, the sky outside the window had become very dark. "The train will arrive at Hogwarts in 5 minutes. Please leave your luggage on the train and we will take you to school." The voice of the conductor spread throughout all the carriages. The speed of the running train was slowly decreasing, and the terminal station Hogsmeade was about to arrive. Hearing the conductor's voice reminder, Scott took out his pocket watch to check the time. At this time, Roger was also awakened by the conductor's voice. He sat in his seat and looked at the lights of Hogsmeade in the distance through the glass window. "Let's go, Roger," Scott called out, stood up and pushed open the compartment door. Roger stood up and casually pulled his robe, and the two walked to the door of the carriage to wait. With a long whistle, the train slowly stopped, and the students sitting in other compartments also came out one after another. The carriage door opened, and Scott and Roger got off first. They walked past the platform and headed for a row of dilapidated carriages parked outside the platform. At this time, Rubeus Hagrid, the keykeeper and gamekeeper of Hogwarts, was standing on the other side of the platform, calling out to the freshmen of this year in a loud voice as in previous years, "First-year freshmen. First-year freshmen, come here." His stature was unusually tall, and he was very conspicuous in the crowd. He held the magic lamp in his hand high, like a beacon to guide the freshmen who knew nothing. "Look, those little guys, Hagrid is like an ostrich mother with a group of ducklings." Roger pointed at the staggering freshman with a chuckle. "I remember you were one of the ducklings," Scott said unhappily. Although he said that, he also laughed. After all, Roger's metaphor is actually quite appropriate. The students around him were also amused by Roger's words. Scott naturally turned his head and greeted the girl walking behind him. "Hello, Penelope." Penelope Crivet, a 6th-year female student from Ravenclaw, has beautiful long brown curly hair and is a smart and beautiful female prefect. "Good evening, Scott." Penelope covered her mouth and laughed a few times. "Oh, and Roger, you made me laugh." "Of course, thank you for your compliment, Miss Crivet." Roger made a very proud and exaggerated expression, which made Penelope laugh non-stop. The three got on the same carriage and sat down. Before the carriage started, another figure suddenly climbed up quickly. Good evening, Penelope." The tall and thin red-haired boy sat directly next to Penelope after getting on the carriage. He whispered hello, and Scott and Roger both heard that his voice was a little nervous. "Good evening, Percy." Penelope was much more generous than him. Percy Weasley, a Gryffindor student in the same year as Penelope. There is definitely something fishy between the two of them. Closing square bracket. Roger winked at Scott. "You're not the one who said that." Closing square bracket. Scott gave him a calm look in return. Percy Weasley seemed to have just noticed the other two people in the carriage. He raised his head slightly and said with some reserve, "Hello, Davis, Trollope." "Hello, Weasley." Scott and Roger responded indifferently. At this time, the carriage started. Percy retracted his gaze, and whispered with Penelope. Scott and Roger, who were almost ignored, looked at each other, and the two began to talk about their respective elective courses in the new school year. Scott has taken 3 courses, Ancient Runes, Arithmetic Divination, and Care of Magical Creatures, since the 3rd grade, and he has no plans to change them in the new school year. But Roger was hesitating whether to give up a course. "I regret it. I think I really shouldn't have chosen the divination class," Roger said distressedly, Just like Professor Trelawney said, I don't have the third eye at all. Roger chose the divination class because of interest, but this class is too special. People without the talent for prediction will never achieve anything by hard work. Maybe you can choose to give up this class. Scott suggested. Go talk to Professor Flitwick, he should agree to your request. Okay, I'll go. Roger accepted his suggestion. Oh, are you talking about the divination class? Percy suddenly interrupted. Professor McGonagall said Professor Trelawney is a liar. But this class is easy to get high scores, as long as you predict your miserable future to Professor Trelawney during the exam. Of course, the more miserable the better. After saying that, he looked at the two boys with some complacency. Scott and Roger looked at each other and didn't say anything. At this time, Percy added, You know, I got 12 certificates in the OWL's ordinary wizarding levels last school year. Oh, I know you're great, Percy. Penelope glanced at Scott and Roger awkwardly, and she began to talk about some interesting experiences in her summer vacation to divert Percy's attention. Scott and Roger didn't say anything else. When the carriage stopped in front of the gate of Hogwarts Castle, the two of them jumped down first. They quickened their pace and walked towards the hall. Roger sighed in a low voice. Beautiful Miss Clearwater, the flower of Ravenclaw, her vision is really not very good. I understand that Weasley wants to tell us some useful experience, but he is really not good at speaking, right? Scott smiled and said nothing, turning his head to look behind. A slightly fat boy was walking quickly from behind. He squeezed directly between Scott and Roger and said excitedly, Good evening. Scott always seems to be able to notice people out of sight. Can you tell me how you do it? Oh, by the way, you were talking about Penino's boyfriend Percy Weasley just now. Roger was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, Eddie, you are always so sharp about these gossips, and I always can't help but suspect that you have more than 2 ears and 1 mouth. Oh, thank you for the compliment, Roger. Eddie raised his head proudly. I just have the latest explosive news here. He proudly took out a newspaper from his robe and shook it. You know, the Savior, Potter and his friend Weasley didn't catch the train back to school today. I suspect they drove a flying car to school. Flying car. Roger reached out and snatched the newspaper from Eddie's hand. It was a freshly published Evening Prophet. Scott leaned over and took a look. The front page headline of the newspaper read, Fort Anglia car can fly, Muggles are greatly surprised. Roger read as he walked. 2 Muggles in London are sure they saw an old car flying over the post office building. At noon in Norfolk, Mrs. Hetty Bayliss was drying clothes. Mr. Angus Fleet of Peebles reported to the police. At this time, the students around also came over and stretched their ears to listen to Roger reading the newspaper. Roger quickly finished reading the report and stuffed the newspaper back into Eddie's hand. Eddie, the newspaper did not say that the flying car was driven by Potter and Weasley. But I think it was them. Eddie said confidently. Is this true? Weasley, your brother drove a flying car to school. Someone in the crowd asked Percy. Before Percy could answer, Scott raised his head sharply. Eddie followed Scott's gaze and saw a Fort Anglia falling from the sky and flying past the wall of Hogwarts Castle. Look, the flying car is coming. Eddie immediately shouted excitedly. Until all the students sat down at the long table in the auditorium, everyone was still talking about the flying car with great interest. In such an atmosphere, the Sorting Hat was very unhappy that no one appreciated the new song it had carefully prepared this year. Scott sat with his roommates at the long table in Ravenclaw. Eddie was still very excited. He shouted, Did you see that? The car hit the Whomping Willow. Oh, poor Potter and Weasley, I wonder if they will be hammered into meat patties by the irritable tree, and become sandwiched with the poor car. Hey, Penino, who was sitting opposite, couldn't help but glared at Eddie and interrupted him, Shut up, Eddie. They will be fine. If you noticed, Professor Snape has already taken care of it. Eddie shrugged. Really? Then let's pray to Merlin for Potter and Weasley, hoping that they will not be put into the crucible by the angry Professor Snape and cooked, or made into potion materials. Maybe, the material for our next potion class will be the nails of the Savior. At this time, Professor McGonagall led this year's freshmen into the hall. Scott coughed and asked Eddie to shut up his nonsense mouth. Professor McGonagall walked to the front of the teacher's seat and picked up the angry Sorting Hat from the high stool. The sorting ceremony began. Scott turned his head and saw Harry Potter and Ron Weasley standing at the door of the hall with their luggage in a mess. They didn't notice at all that Professor Snape in a black robe was standing behind them with a dark face. So they were quickly led away by Professor Snape with a sneer. Eddie, who was always very sensitive to such things, also saw this scene. He covered his mouth and trembled all over, afraid that he would laugh out loud. The sorting ceremony continued, and Scott and his classmates applauded and welcomed every little wizard who was assigned to Ravenclaw. When the sorting ceremony ended, rich food immediately appeared on the long table. Everyone began to eat and drink. Scott noticed that Professor Snape walked into the hall again, and then Headmaster Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall left with him. Will they be okay? Will they be expelled from school? A faint voice sounded next to Scott. It was Milton Graves, who had long, soft light brown hair and was a very delicate literary boy. Scott secretly sighed. It has been 3 years, and he still hasn't adapted to his roommate's speaking style. Of course they are fine, Milton, that's the savior, there will always be some small privileges. Roger, who was sitting on the other side, answered indifferently. Well, I hope they are all fine. Milton looked at the starry sky on the ceiling of the hall with melancholy eyes, whether it's Potter and Weasley or that poor Whomping Willow. What Eddie said just now is terrible. Eddie's expression at this time was like constipation. Oh, Milton, I thought you should know, what I said just now was just a joke. Really? Milton stared at Eddie with clear mint green eyes. Yes, of course, I like to talk nonsense. Eddie admitted defeat directly, and began to chew the chicken leg indignantly after Milton looked away. Scott and Roger both raised their mouths and laughed secretly, although they were not good at dealing with Milton, who would cry in the wind at any time. But seeing Eddie being defeated still made them happy. In addition, Scott had always wanted to call Milton Lindayu of England, but no one here understood the joke, so he could only label Milton as Dayu in his heart. By the way, I have good news to tell you. Milton gently put down the knife and fork in his hand. He always ate very little. Scott and the others stopped eating and turned to look at him. Of course, I plan to return to the dormitory and solemnly announce the news. Milton smiled embarrassedly. I think this will be more ceremonial. Okay. Scott and the other two nodded without objection. Although Eddie was choked by Milton's behavior of keeping him on edge, he did not ask any more questions. Countless similar experiences in the past told him not to try to change Milton's mind at this time. Milton is a romanticist, and ritual is very important to him. Scott had actually guessed what the good news Milton wanted to announce was at this time. He noticed that at the long table of Hufflepuff next to him, Gideon Crumb, a 7th-year student, was looking at Milton with encouragement. According to the news that Eddie had spread before, Gideon Crumb had become the bagpiper of the famous magic singing group, Weird Sisters, last school year. Sure enough, when all of them had eaten and drunk and returned to the dormitory, Milton solemnly announced the good news at the first time. He, Milton Graves, has successfully joined the Weird Sisters singing group as a reserve cellist and is planning to officially go on stage one day in the future. Hearing the news, Scott and Roger applauded and congratulated Milton warmly, but Eddie asked curiously, Milton, don't you like classical music? I remember you were a member of the Hogwarts Classical Music Club. Why did you join a rock singing group? Oh, maybe you don't understand, Eddie. Milton sighed quietly, and the warm atmosphere in the dormitory suddenly became subtle. Milton sat on his bed, stretched out his hand and gently touched the blue flannel bed curtain on his bed frame, and said intoxicatedly, music is a feeling, an expression. Of course I know classical music. The difference between music and rock music, but Eddie, as long as it is beautiful music, I will fall in love with them. You know, I am trying to combine classical music and rock music. I plan. Eddie regretted it at this moment. Milton kept talking about his wild ideas about music, but he frowned and couldn't understand at all, so he frequently sent looks for help to Scott and Roger. Oh, sorry, I have to go to the bathroom. Scott picked up the basket containing toiletries and a change of clothes and quickly walked to the bedroom door. After opening the door, he turned to look at Milton with encouraging eyes. Milton, I didn't expect Eddie to be interested in music. I think you should let him feel more of the charm of music. Maybe he will fall in love with music like you in the future. Roger very smartly followed Scott with his basket. Yes, I will. Milton said excitedly, his mint green eyes shining. Well, see you later. Scott and Roger left the dormitory under Eddie's desperate eyes. Oh, poor Eddie. I hope he can achieve something under Milton's tutelage. On the way to the bathroom, Roger held his chest and exclaimed loudly. Scott laughed with him. However, they soon stopped laughing. When they returned to the dormitory after taking a shower, Milton's music class was still continuing. Perhaps due to encouragement, Milton seemed very enthusiastic and almost wanted to express his love for music. At this moment, Eddie was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes vacant, his expression dazed, and he was counting his 10 fingers mechanically. Scott felt that he could not sleep in such an atmosphere tonight, so he suggested to Milton, Milton, the knowledge you mentioned is too profound. Maybe you can give us an intuitive feeling. I know you must have it. There are a lot of wonderful inspirations. Play it and let us enjoy it. Quote. As Scott spoke, he could feel Eddie's resentful look over him. But the proposal was warmly welcomed by Roger and Eddie. Although Milton hesitated, with everyone's enthusiastic encouragement, he took out his cello. A mini cello recital began. The next day, Scott woke up early in the morning. His 3 roommates were still asleep at this time, and Scott could hear their long breathing. They went to bed a little late last night because the mini concert last night ended up in trouble. Scott admitted that Milton was an inspired composer and cellist, and most of the time his music was amazing. But sometimes some of his inspirations were not easy to be accepted. Especially after he met the members of the Weird Sisters singing group, his inspirations went off the track. At the mini concert last night, Milton first played a few of his new works, which were all very beautiful music, and Scott and others couldn't help but indulge in them. Afterwards, Scott, Roger and Eddie sincerely praised Milton's amazing musical talent. Maybe they gave too much encouragement. Milton then played an experimental piece of his exploration of a new style. This piece is really terrible. The expressions of Scott and the other 2 slowly solidified in this song, until someone knocked on the door of the dormitory, and they were freed from the terrible, devil's voice. Milton was so terrible after letting himself go that students living in nearby dormitories came to protest one after another. The terrible noise disturbed their rest. This hit Milton hard. This delicate boy felt that his musical talent was not worthy of his friends' praise because his experimental works only received unanimous bad reviews. He lost confidence and sat decadently on the windowsill of the dormitory, looking at the moon and crying. As roommates, Scott and the other 2 boys had to rack their brains to comfort him. In this way, it was not until after midnight that Milton finally managed to put his mood together and went to bed. Scott also secretly vowed that he would never encourage Milton to play in the dormitory again. It was simply a disaster. At this time, he took out his pocket watch from under the pillow and looked at the time. It was 7:03 in the morning, while the school breakfast time was 8 o'clock to 8:30, and the class time was 9 o'clock. He got up from the bed and left the dormitory quietly. After washing up, he returned to the dormitory again, changed his pajamas, put on clothes, shoes and socks, and then picked up his wand from the pillow and held it in his hand. This is a black wand, made of ebony with dragon nerves, 12¼ inches long. Scott still remembers that Mr. Ollivander, who sold him this wand, talked to him excitedly at the time. He said that this black wand wood has an impressive appearance and reputation, and is very suitable for various combat magic and transfiguration. He also told Scott that the owners of ebony wands are often unconventional, have strong personalities, or feel comfortable with the identity of outsiders. So the perfect match for the ebony wand is that no matter how much pressure from the outside world, you can stick to your beliefs and will not easily waver in your goals. As for the dragon nerves, the wands usually produced have the greatest power and can cast the most gorgeous spells. Dragon wands tend to learn faster than other types. If they can win loyalty from the original owner, they can change allegiance, but they always maintain a close connection with the current owner. Finally, he predicted that Scott must be a wizard who would be difficult to shake his goal, and would be very good at transfiguration and combat magic. Scott still couldn't help smiling when he thought of his experience of buying a wand. He was very satisfied with his wand. He put the wand upside down and inserted it into the wand cover fixed on the lining of his robe. Then he took out a copy of Standard Spells Level 4 Inches and a brand new notebook from the bookshelf at the head of the bed, picked up a feather pen from the pen holder, turned around and walked out of the dormitory and gently closed the door. This morning they had to take a spell class. Professor Phileas Flitwick, the dean of Ravenclaw College, who taught this course, decided to go to the common room before breakfast to preview the contents of the textbook. Speaking of which, because Scott's performance in Transfiguration class was far better than that in Charms class, Professor Flitwick was a little disappointed with him. Of course, Scott knew that the cute old man was just angry with Professor McGonagall. Ravenclaw students performed best in the class of Gryffindor Dean, which made him a little embarrassed. After understanding that Scott's outstanding Transfiguration skills were only due to his talent, and not because he was not interested in other courses or was lazy, he began to take care of Scott with a friendly face. After getting to know each other, he once joked with Scott, "Mr. Trollope obviously has the personality that Hufflepuff likes and the Transfiguration talent that Gryffindor likes, but in the end he was assigned to Ravenclaw, which shows that wisdom is the most outstanding trait in you." Scott answered sincerely, "A good personality can make people more popular, and a good talent can make learning a subject easier, but only extraordinary wisdom can make a wizard go further." In short, after hearing his answer, Professor Flitwick was very happy and wanted to give him 100 points on the spot. But he obviously couldn't do that, and finally he chose to reward Scott with a notebook of charms. That was the notebook written by Professor Flitwick when he sorted out the basic knowledge of charms a few years ago. Although there are copies of this notebook in the library of the Ravenclaw College Common Room, the one Professor Flitwick gave to Scott is the original, which is completely different in preciousness. Unlike a copy of a Muggle book, magic notes written by powerful wizards often carry some magical magic. The most fundamental function of this magic is to make it easier for people who read the notes to understand what the author wants to convey. Professor Flitwick was obviously still unwilling to lose to Professor McGonagall. He hoped to stimulate Scott's interest in spells in this way, and then try to catch up with his progress in Transfiguration. Later, this notebook did help Scott a lot. After he spent a lot of spare time to study the notes carefully, he had a solid foundation in spells. This made him make obvious progress in the study of spells. Although there is still a slight gap compared to his performance in Transfiguration, it has made Professor Flitwick very satisfied. So, although Scott has the most talent in Transfiguration and Professor McGonagall has helped him a lot, his favorite and most respected professor is still Professor Flitwick. Scott walked through the empty corridor, walked down the stairs to the common room, and found that the common room was not empty at this time. A small boy was curled up on the large sofa next to the fireplace, sleeping soundly. He was a freshman who had just enrolled this year. Scott didn't know why the freshman slept here so early in the morning, so he walked closer. Although the boy was still asleep, his pale face, slightly swollen red eyes and tear marks on his face showed that he seemed to have been crying for a long time. "Hey," Scott reached out and patted his shoulder, and the boy opened his eyes in a daze. "Freshman, why are you sleeping here? Is it because you are too excited and get up too early?" Scott joked. The boy's eyes immediately burst into tears, and his voice was crying, "I have been sleeping here since last night." Scott frowned and asked him, "What happened?" The boy trembled and said, They didn't let me into the dormitory." Scott frowned even tighter now. He couldn't understand why this happened in Ravenclaw. To be honest, Scott didn't really want to get involved in the freshman's affairs. He is neither a professor nor a prefect, and it is not his responsibility to deal with conflicts between students. It's just, no one else has gotten up yet, and he can't leave the new students here. All right. Scott walked to the sofa opposite the freshman and sat down. "So freshman, what's your name?" "Jacob." The boy sniffed. "Jacob Kent." Scott nodded. "Okay, Jacob. I'm Scott Trollope, 4th grade." "Hello, Mr. Trollope," Jacob said softly. Scott was not interested in the reasons for the conflicts among the freshmen, so he asked directly, "Jacob, why didn't you go to the prefects for help? You should know at least 2 prefects." As usual, after the dinner yesterday, there were 5 the prefects, and prefects are responsible for bringing new students to Ravenclaw Tower. Jacob sniffed loudly again and said vaguely, "It's Miss Taylor and Mr. Cooper. But they both hate me. I dare not go to them." "Hate you?" Scott realized that things might be more troublesome than he thought. He looked into Jacob's eyes and asked him, "Can you tell me what happened? What did you do?" Why didn't it matter whether it was the freshmen or the two prefects? Well, not friendly to you. I didn't. That really wasn't what I did. They don't believe me. Jacob suddenly raised his voice and screamed. Stop. Scott was so noisy that he had a headache and quickly stopped him. Perhaps seeing Scott's bad expression, Jacob immediately apologized in a low voice with fear on his face. I'm sorry, Mr. Trollope, but it's really not me. So what happened? Just when Scott was about to ask what was going on, he saw Penelope coming down the stairs of the girls' dormitory from the corner of his eye, so he quickly stopped asking, stood up and walked over. Good morning, Penelope. Oh, good morning, Scott. Penelope was a little surprised. What's the matter? Over there. Scott pointed to Jacob, who was still curled up on the sofa. Jacob Kent, a freshman, was kicked out of the dormitory by his roommates and spent the night in the common room. I think it should be a matter for the prefect to deal with. He couldn't wait to get this out of the way. Oh, Scott, Penelope said with a smile, maybe you could help the poor boy directly. I know you can handle it just fine. No, I'm not a prefect, this is not my responsibility. Scott refused immediately. Okay, Penelope shrugged slightly, it's very Ravenclaw to look on coldly, but... She smiled teasingly. Maybe next year. Professor Flitwick has always liked you, and he may choose you to be the new male prefect. Then let's talk about it next year. Scott also shrugged his shoulders and came to Jacob with Penelope. Jacob had already stood up from the sofa and looked at the two of them with some trepidation. Scott said in as gentle a tone as possible, Okay, Jacob. This is Penelope Clivet, a sixth-year prefect who is also a Ravenclaw prefect. Don't worry, she will help you. Quote. Miss Crevet. Jacob glanced at Penelope and quickly lowered his head. Hello, Jacob. Penelope smiled reassuringly. Come on, take me to your dormitory. But, Jacob was still a little scared, and he looked at Scott with pleading eyes. Unfortunately, Scott had no intention of continuing to participate in this matter. He just comforted the boy. Go ahead, Jacob. Penelope is a prefect, and she can speak better than me. Penelope stood aside and kept smiling, thoughtfully not revealing Scott's words. When Jacob heard Scott say this, he could only take Penelope to the male students' dormitory with his head drooping. He couldn't help but look back several times on the way, but Scott had already sat on the sofa in front of the window and spread out the standard spells and didn't pay attention to his gaze. 20 minutes later, Scott closed the book, but Penelope had not yet come out of the boys' dormitory. It seems that this matter is really troublesome, Scott just muttered, still not wanting to participate. He tucked his textbooks and notebooks under his arm and walked out of the common room. Descending the tower via the long spiral staircase, Scott saw Percy Weasley lingering beneath Ravenclaw Tower. Good morning, Weasley. Scott took the initiative to say hello. Are you waiting for Penelope? Yes, good morning, Trollope. Percy Weasley immediately stopped wandering and stood up straighter. It's just that his face is a little red, and the freckles on his face are more obvious. Scott immediately understood why Penelope got up so early, but he was not sorry for delaying the two's date. After all, that's really the prefect's job, isn't it? But, I'm afraid you'll have to wait, Weasley. He could smoothly explain Penelope's lateness. Unfortunately, something happened. He didn't want to tell Gryffindor about Ravenclaw, so he vaguely said, anyway, it needs to be handled by Penelope, the prefect. She is busy now. Quote. Oh, it's okay. The prefects certainly need to fulfill their duties. Percy Weasley obviously accepted this well. Thank you for telling me, Trollope. After saying goodbye to Percy Weasley, Scott left the Ravenclaw Tower and walked across the long elevated stone bridge towards the hall across the cliff. It was almost breakfast time. Some students left their common rooms one after another, and Hogwarts Castle gradually woke up in the morning light. Good morning, Scott. In the lobby of the hall, two overlapping voices suddenly greeted Scott. Good morning, Weasleys. Facing the red-haired Weasley twins, Scott smiled more naturally than when facing their brother Percy Weasley. Oh, Merlin's stinky socks. We've known each other for 3 years. Scott actually called us Weasleys. Maybe he doesn't know that our parents also gave us names. Fred and George put their arms around Scott's shoulders, one on each side, and started to accuse him one after another. I bet, George, he also called Percy Weasley when he was talking to him just now. Fred raised the monocular in his other hand. Obviously, Fred, Mr. Trollope puts us and Percy on the same level in his interpersonal relationships. George said angrily. The two shouted at Scott's ear at the same time, "This is simply an insult to us." "Okay, sorry." Scott surrendered quickly. "Forgive me, Fred, George, I met 3 Weasleys in a short period of time." "Unfortunately, Mr. Trollope," George said. Fred squinted his eyes. "Our little sister also enrolled this year." George raised his eyebrows. "Plus our stupid little brother." The two finally concluded in unison, "Now there are 5 Weasleys in Gryffindor." Scott couldn't help laughing a few times. "That's really fortunate, I'm not in Gryffindor." "This is really sad. Professor McGonagall's most proud student actually said that." Fred sobbed loudly. George also wiped his tears. "Merlin, Professor McGonagall obviously likes him so much. Why did you two get up so early today?" Scott looked at Fred and George inquiringly. "Unless you didn't sleep last night." "We have slept enough during the summer vacation. And the great adventure is calling us." Fred saluted strangely. George raised his head proudly. "Mr. Trollope, who has been absent from adventure activities for a whole year, will not understand this truth. But I support you, don't I?" Scott pointed to the brass monocular telescope in Fred's hand. "This is just your Christmas gift last year." Fred shortened the telescope and put it in the pocket of his robe. "It can't let us see the annoying old filch in advance when we wander around the castle at night." George also took out an identical telescope from his pocket and shook it. "We can only use it to observe what Percy is doing secretly. Maybe he wants to ambush under the Ravenclaw Tower and kill a few competitors unexpectedly." Fred guessed. George's eyes widened in horror. This way he can ensure that he will become the head of the student union smoothly in the 7th grade. Scott couldn't help laughing when he heard it. "Maybe he will choose to kill you 2 annoying brothers first," he said. "Oh, Percy must have thought so more than once." George blinked. Fred continued. "He wants to be the Minister of Magic, and we may become his future stain. He thinks that as long as the stain is removed, he can become a pure and flawless Minister of Magic." The two talked about strange things and laughed again. After laughing, Fred suddenly said with a serious face, "We want to tell you, Scott. Welcome to join us again in the new school year." George also put on a serious look. Scott was a little surprised. He only met the twins in a few night outings in the 1st and 2nd grades, and they hid from the pursuit of the janitor Filch together. And last school year he was immersed in research and did not go out at night. Unexpectedly, the twins regarded him as a night outing partner. "Maybe," Scott smiled and said uncertainly. "Let's just say it. If you have any new discoveries, you must tell us. Goodbye." The twins thought that he had agreed to it, and ran away with a smile. Scott shook his head and walked through the foyer into the auditorium. He sat at the long table and read a book for a while, and then food appeared on the table. It was time for breakfast. He put the book aside, took a glass of milk, some sausages and bacon, a sunny-side-up egg, and a soda bread. Then he began to enjoy his breakfast slowly. When Scott was about to finish eating, his 3 roommates appeared at the long table. "Scott, why did you get up so early?" Roger yawned and sat next to Scott. "Maybe I got used to it during the summer vacation." Scott said, "I followed my parents' schedule during the summer vacation." "You know, Scott, something big happened last night when we didn't know." Eddie tore the bread into pieces and put it into his mouth, while lowering his voice and mumbling. "What's the matter?" Scott drank the milk in the cup in one breath and put down the cup in his hand. "You know, at the beginning of the school year, freshmen always go back later than us because they have to learn to recognize the way. So we missed this incident last night." Eddie was obviously very sorry that he didn't get the first-hand news, but he still told Scott excitedly, "Last night, when Cooper and Taylor led the freshmen to climb the spiral staircase of Ravenclaw Tower, a freshman boy pushed a girl down the stairs." When Scott heard this, he immediately thought of something, so he asked him, "Is the girl okay?" "It's okay. Cooper used the levitation spell on her in time," Eddie said with a smile. "Anyway, the boy who pushed people caused public outrage. He was kicked out of the dormitory by his roommates and slept in the common room for a night. He was sent back by Penelope in the morning. So that's it." Scott understood that the boy was Jacob Kent. But, He always felt that the boy's behavior didn't seem to be courageous enough to push his classmates down the stairs. But Penelope had already handled the matter. Scott thought she would handle it better than Cooper and Taylor. So he quickly dropped the matter. I need to talk to Professor Flitwick, so I'll go to the charms classroom first. Scott picked up the book on the table and stood up. See you in class later, Roger, Milton. I'll go with you, Scott. Roger stood up with a book in his arms and a sandwich in his hand. I need to ask the professor to cancel my divination class. Then let's go together. Scott had no objection. The two of them walked against the flow of students who entered the auditorium one after another, all the way to the charms classroom on the 4th floor of the main castle. Scott pushed open the door of the classroom, and sure enough, Professor Flitwick was already standing on the pile of books next to the podium. Professor Flitwick always came to the classroom in advance to watch every student arrive. Good morning, Professor Flitwick. Scott and Roger greeted respectfully. Good morning, Scott, Roger. Professor Flitwick responded cordially. He has part of the goblin blood, which makes him very short and his voice is very sharp. Professor. Roger stepped forward first and explained his request to Professor Flitwick. Professor Flitwick did not object after hearing what Roger said. He smiled and said, "This is normal, Roger. I think students can allocate their time reasonably, and it is also a good idea to rationally give up some topics that are destined to be fruitless. The embodiment of wisdom." Thank you, Professor. Roger was delighted that he had been recognized by Professor Flitwick. Then your divination class will be cancelled this school year. I will explain it to Professor Trelawney. Professor Flitwick nodded and looked at Scott again. Do you have something to tell me too? Scott. Of course. Scott stepped forward and smiled confidently. I can't wait to show you a result, so I came to the classroom early. This is also an early birthday gift to you. Birthday present. Professor Flitwick screamed excitedly. Although his birthday on October 17th is still more than a month away, but what the heck? Oh, I love birthday gifts. What are you waiting for? Mr. Trollope. He couldn't help but look forward to it. I'll show you right now. Scott reached into the deformed lizard skin bag on his waist and took out an oil painting that was almost as tall as him. Professor Flitwick smiled. He could see that Scott's deformed lizard pocket was just a disguise. It was clearly blessed with a traceless stretching spell to hold such a large thing, but he did not expose it. He just looked expectantly at the oil painting covered by a white cloth in front of him. Could it be that, Mr. Trollope, you taught yourself magic painting? Professor Flitwick rubbed his hands. It's not a magic painting. Scott reached out and pulled the white cloth. Although I only used Muggle painting techniques, I feel that this painting can better demonstrate my achievements than magic paintings. After saying that, he pulled off the white cloth. Oh, looking at the oil painting suddenly displayed in front of him, Professor Flitwick's eyes widened for a moment, and he suddenly let out a high-pitched scream and fell off the stack of books. Roger quickly went to help him, but Professor Flitwick didn't care about it. He climbed up from the ground and walked quickly to the painting, raising his head and watching obsessively. Oh, it's true, it's incredible. He kept exclamating from his mouth. Scott looked at Professor Flitwick's reaction and couldn't help but smile smugly. Professor, are you satisfied with this birthday gift? Satisfied, so satisfied. Professor Flitwick nodded repeatedly, with a smile on his face. This is. Roger also saw Scott's painting, but now he is very confused. What Scott gave to Professor Flitwick was a very abstract painting. This painting does not depict anything specific, only a variety of different colors splashed across a large area of the painting. Different colors seem to blend in and contradict each other. Scott looked at Roger's expression of doubt about life, and deliberately asked him, "What do you think of my painting, Roger?" Roger obviously couldn't see what was worthy of praise in this painting, but Professor Flitwick showed that he liked it very much. He could only praise it bravely. Well, it's a beautiful painting, Scott. Listening to Roger's dry praise, Scott laughed several times with joy. Oh, Roger, your understanding of magic is not to this extent, so you don't understand what amazing things Scott has done. Professor Flitwick was still very excited. Yes, this is amazing. Quote. At this time, students entered the classroom one after another. They all smiled and talked about Ron Weasley receiving a roaring letter, and then walked over and gathered around them curiously. This class is a class shared by Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff students, so Scott also saw Roger's ex-Hufflepuff girlfriend Miss Mill. But Scott knew that Roger didn't care about this at all. He was confused by Professor Flitwick's words at this time. There was obviously no magic in this painting, but Professor Flitwick praised Scott for doing amazing things in magic. This situation was beyond Roger's understanding. The other students were obviously wondering why they were here admiring a worthless Muggle painting. At this time, Milton also arrived. He came over with great interest and asked, "Scott, is this your new work?" Milton, an artistic boy, didn't just like music. In fact, he had a keen appreciation of all art and beauty. So even though his character is often intolerable, Scott, who has studied painting since childhood in this life, will often communicate with him. He found this useful because all arts have something in common. At this moment, Milton revealed the author of the painting, and the students who were watching immediately focused their attention on Scott. Most of them were suspicious, with a few looks of disdain mixed in. But what they didn't expect was that Milton exclaimed in exaggeration the moment he saw the painting, "This is so beautiful. You used some beautiful color combinations. They are flowing and seem to have real life." He stared at the painting closely. "Oh, calm, wise, passionate, brave. If you are depicting a person, it must be a person with good moral character." Milton was a little intoxicated and a little confused. "I think this painting gives me a familiar feeling, but I can't clearly see what you are depicting. But I want to congratulate you, Scott. I think your artistic level has improved a lot." Scott smiled. Sure enough, Milton's perception of art is very keen. Quote. However, other students in the classroom entered a state of doubt about life with Roger. Only Scott noticed that Professor Flitwick's face was a little red. Ahem. Professor Flitwick clenched his fist and coughed. He waved the wand in his hand, and the painting Scott was holding flew up and stuck to the wall behind the podium. "Everyone, go and take your seats." He directed the students to disperse. After the students were seated, Professor Flitwick stood on the pile of books next to the podium. "This is a special birthday present from Mr. Trollope." He pointed his wand at the picture on the wall with great pride. The students began to whisper, not understanding what Professor Flitwick was trying to say. Scott even heard someone saying that he was sensationalizing and deceiving Professor Flitwick with a worthless Muggle oil painting. Professor Flitwick looked around the classroom. "I'll add 50 points to Ravenclaw," he shouted, "for Mr. Trollope's amazing magical abilities." After his words fell, the classroom suddenly became quiet for a moment, and then became more noisy the next second. The Hufflepuff students were all shouting that it was unfair, and a few Ravenclaw students also showed disapproval. Only Roger and Milton, who were sitting with Scott, congratulated him. Roger believed in Professor Flitwick's judgment, while Milton really thought the painting was great. Scott knew that most of the students in Ravenclaw were like Roger. Although they were all confused, they were smart and never made conclusions easily, and they would choose to believe their dean. "Quiet!" Professor Flitwick shrieked to stop the students' noise, and waved the wand in his hand with some excitement. "Of course you don't understand why I'm giving Ravenclaw points for a painting that doesn't move, but I'll explain." The students immediately became obedient and quieted down. Scott felt that this was also because the students in this class were Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. If Gryffindor and Slytherin students were here, they might not be so obedient. Professor Flitwick nodded with satisfaction and said to the students, "As you explore magic more deeply, you will slowly have a clearer and clearer understanding of magic." His tone of voice was cadenced and full of passion. "Then you will feel that the magic power in each of you will present different states due to individual differences." Although they didn't know what this had to do with the painting, the students were still listening carefully. Professor Flitwick gave an example. If your headmaster Dumbledore saw this painting, he would definitely recognize the theme of this painting at first sight. His short body jumped on the pile of books and straightened his chest. "Ahem. If you throw away all the appearances of the form, Mr. Trollope is depicting me." "So that's it," Milton blurted out excitedly. "That's why I feel that this painting gives me a sense of familiarity." He looked up at the painting on the wall. The beautiful qualities of wisdom and courage coexisting, this painting really depicts Professor Flitwick. Milton, who is very emotional, never hesitates to praise others, sometimes even a little corny. "Ahem. Anyway," Professor Flitwick blushed again, Thank you for the compliment, Mr. Graves. At this time, the other students also looked at the painting carefully with new eyes. However, they looked again and again, but they could not see Professor Flitwick from the colorful abstract painting. A Hufflepuff student raised his hand. Mr. Diggory, please. Professor Flitwick looked at him. Cedric Diggory, a star figure in Hufflepuff in the same class as Scott. Scott also turned his head to look at him. Professor. Cedric stood up. Excuse me, when you said, put aside the appearance of the body, did you mean that what Scott painted was actually your magic power? Professor Flitwick smiled and pointed at Scott. Why don't we let Mr. Trollop answer this question himself? Seeing Professor Flitwick's signal, Scott stood up and said, that's right. Just like Professor Flitwick said, everyone's magic power is different. He turned to look at Cedric. To be precise, this painting is a painting of my feelings about Professor Flitwick's magic power after I sensed it. Is that what you saw? Cedric asked him. Scott shook his head. It's not really seeing. It's a kind of perception, but it's very clear. I just recorded my feelings in the form of painting. Yes, magic perception, Professor Flitwick said sharply. Mr. Trollop has done what most adult wizards cannot. Not only did he clearly sense my magic, but he also used unprecedented creativity to accurately express his feelings to others through painting. Although this is a Muggle oil painting, I think the meaning in it is more valuable than a moving magical portrait. Quote. Professor. Cedric asked again, are you saying that not everyone can do this through in-depth study of magic? Yes, it requires a talent for perception. Professor Flitwick did not deny it. He further explained. Basically everyone can perceive magic, but some people can only perceive it vaguely, while some people can clearly detect the information contained in the wizard's magic. Is this why you can always detect who is approaching you in advance? Roger whispered to Scott. Scott nodded and said to Roger and Milton, I think Milton also has this talent. Roger agreed, yes, Milton, you've always been very perceptive. It's still far behind compared to Scott. Milton was in a good mood at the moment and seemed to have forgotten last night's failure. He even joked to himself, also, most people would just say that my personality is too sensitive. At this time, the official class time has arrived. Professor Flitwick immediately ended the topic on magic perception and asked everyone to open their respective textbooks. Please read the first chapter of the book. What we are going to learn today is the flying curse. Scott didn't know if others had discovered that he could roughly judge a person's personality and inner character by sensing magic. This can actually be seen from Milton's interpretation of the painting. This was also the reason why he thought Jacob Kent was not lying before. At the same time, he was also thinking that in the original book, Tom Riddle, who had not yet become Voldemort, was loved by all the teachers in school, but Dumbledore never believed him, probably because his magic performance could not convince Dumbledore. When the midday sun penetrated the classroom windows and hit everyone, the morning spell class ended. Thank you for the gift, Scott. Now, I'm going to show this student work to the other professors. Flitwick spoke to Scott alone, then waved his wand to make the painting float behind him, and left the classroom with his head held high. Oh, now you are going to be completely famous, Scott. Roger patted Scott on the shoulder, indicating that he should pay attention to the looks of the students around him. This is good. Scott has such a talent and needs to be shown. Milton was happy for Scott. The Ravenclaw classmates also came over to congratulate Scott. Congratulations, Scott. Good job, Scott. Often, Ravenclaws admire those who go the extra mile, no matter what. They knew very well that Scott's ability to do things like that couldn't be summed up in one sentence: talent. Talent also requires accumulation of sufficient knowledge and experience to turn into actual strength. Thank you. Scott thanked him calmly. Scott, you did something unexpected again. Cedric of Hufflepuff also walked over with a smile. Scott and he are both members of Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration Club, and the two have a good relationship. The two belong to different academies and are equally talented in the art of transformation. They are both friends and competitors. Cedric also patted Scott on the shoulder. Don't leave us peers too far behind. I'm not stopping, Cedric, Scott said with a smile. Cedric sighed. Looks like I need to work harder. 4 days flew by. On Sunday, Roger woke up everyone in the dormitory early in the morning. What's the matter? Roger. Scott leaned back on the pillow and didn't want to move, only opened his eyes and looked at Roger. At this moment, Roger had put on a full set of Quidditch uniforms and protective gear, holding his broomstick in his hand. Come on, come with me to the stadium and see if Ravenclaw will have any decent newcomers this year, Roger said enthusiastically to his 3 roommates. Please, Milton said vaguely with his eyes closed. I remember the Quidditch team selection is on the weekend of the second week. Roger said. Captain Bruce decided to observe the newcomers who were interested in participating in the team selection a week in advance and give them some guidance. He hopes that the newcomers will perform better in the selection next week. Eddie, who had just sat up, fell back on the bed with a bang, just because of this. What does this have to do with us? Come on, friends, you are all Ravenclaw. Roger raised his voice. I think you need to know more about our college team. Scott felt that Roger's words were completely illogical, and he picked up a pillow and threw it at Roger. We won't go. But Scott and the others finally came to the Quidditch stadium and sat in the audience. Merlin. Roger is so annoying. He murdered our sleep. Eddie gnawed a sandwich and kept complaining. Milton leaned on his seat with lifeless eyes, looking up at the sky still floating with morning mist. Scott also took a piece of bread and ate it slowly. Neither of them responded to Eddie's meaning. But Eddie didn't care. He seemed to be talking happily alone. Yesterday morning, the Gryffindor and Slytherin teams had a conflict here because of the competition for the court. He showed off the news he had inquired about to Scott and Milton. Malfoy, a second-year student in Slytherin, became their new seeker because his father, Malfoy, sponsored the latest flying broom, Nimbus 2001, for their entire team. Seeing that Scott and Milton still didn't respond, he talked about the Ravenclaw Quidditch team in front of him. If you ask me, the most watched Quidditch star in Ravenclaw this year is Chu Jong, a third-year student. It's a pity that she wants to become a seeker, and our seeker will not graduate until next year. Maybe she will temporarily become a substitute seeker. Chapter 11. On the court, several students who were interested in participating in player selection began taking turns to try out under the command of team captain Benjamin Bruce. In the stands, Eddie kept commenting on the performance of these students. That boy Andrew got worse grades than me in the first grade flying class, but he actually has the courage to participate in the player selection. Look, his flying speed is slower than that of a woodcock. Is that Chambers? That kid's skills are really good. Maybe he can fill the vacancy of the team's chaser and form an unpopular partner with that annoying Roger. Beautiful. Look, Chu Jong is very beautiful, isn't she? If you ask me, Bruce should just let her become the seeker. Anyway, our current seeker's performance in previous games is really not very good. Thank you for your explanation, Eddie. Scott said angrily. Although the most useful part is only one sentence, it reminds me of a piece of trivia I read in the Encyclopedia Britannica when I was a child. At this time, Milton asked in a light tone, Scott, which piece of trivia are you talking about? Oh, of course it's the sentence, Andrew flies slower than the woodcock. The woodcock is the slowest flying bird in the world, Eddie answered proudly. Milton blinked, turned to Scott and said, I think I should read some additional Muggle books, such as the Encyclopedia Britannica you mentioned, which may enhance my understanding of the Muggle world. Eddie was shocked when he heard what he said. You haven't read the Encyclopedia Britannica? Well, if I remember correctly, you are a mixed race. Milton said. Yes, my mother was a Muggle, but she never had a say in my education. Okay, Eddie was measured and didn't ask further. But I want to remind you that this set of books has many volumes, and it was even increased to 32 volumes in 1985. And each volume is very thick. But Milton seemed very interested. Okay, I found something that I should do during the Christmas holiday, and that is to buy 32 books. I recommend you read that set of books, Milton, Scott said. After reading it, you will have a better understanding of the world we live in. I will. Hey, look over there. Eddie suddenly interrupted Milton. The Slytherin team is here too. Scott looked up and saw a group of Slytherin students in green robes carrying brooms across the lawn outside the stadium. At this time, Benjamin Bruce also saw the Slytherin students, and he took several Ravenclaw players to greet them. Are they going to fight? Eddie asked expectantly. He had stood up from his seat. No, Scott said calmly, we are Ravenclaw, not Gryffindor. Sure enough, after negotiations between Benjamin Bruce and Marcus Flint, the captain of the Slytherin team, both sides occupied half of the stadium. After a while, Eddie complained, "It's boring. They have been more conservative since Slytherin came. I think we should go back to Ravenclaw Tower." Scott agreed with his proposal. "It's neither training nor a game. There is really no need to sit here and watch Bruce and Flint defend each other." Milton, of course, had no objection. The three of them left the stands and walked outside the stadium without notifying Roger at all. At this time, another group of Slytherin female students came over from the other side of the lawn. "Hey, did you see the blonde girl walking next to Parkinson?" Eddie suddenly became excited and lowered his voice. "Jasmine Travers is the most beautiful girl among the freshmen this year." Quote. Scott glanced after hearing this, and happened to meet Jasmine Travers' eyes. The girl does have an amazingly beautiful appearance, with brilliant blonde hair, a pair of deep silver gray eyes, pale skin, and rosy lips. When Scott looked at her inadvertently, the girl did not dodge her eyes, but smiled slightly. She was like a little princess who had stepped out of a fairy tale, with a proud yet fragile look between her eyebrows. Next, the three Ravenclaw boys and the Slytherin girls passed by each other quietly, and no one made a sound. After Scott and the three of them walked across the lawn in silence, Eddie immediately spoke cheerfully. "Did Miss Travers smile at you just now, Scott? I really have you, and I captured you so easily. That Miss Travers' heart." Scott frowned at this time. He stopped and said to Eddie in a serious tone, "You'd better shut up, Eddie. That girl is not as simple as she appears." "I know what you want to say, Scott." Eddie didn't care. The head of the Travers family is a Death Eater who follows a mysterious man, and is he still imprisoned in Azkaban? Scott continued walking forward. "It's good that you know. Anyway, you'd better not let your jokes reach Miss Travers's ears, otherwise you will get yourself and me into trouble." Quote. "Hey, what you said is too serious." Eddie chased after him. "You should take a good look at Miss Travers, that girl who looks so beautiful and fragile. How could she?" "Eddie." Scott stopped again, turned around, and looked into Eddie's eyes. "I solemnly remind you, Eddie." Milton patted Eddie's shoulder. "You should believe Scott's words. Don't forget the gift he gave to Professor Flitwick." "Gift? That painting." Eddie's face changed immediately when he thought of the meaning of the painting. The painting that Scott gave to Professor Flitwick was another hot topic in Hogwarts Castle in the first few days of school besides Potter's flying car. "You telling the truth?" He still seemed a little unbelievable. "Did you sense her magic?" "At least I think no student in Hogwarts can pretend in front of me." Scott stared at him again, turned around and walked towards the castle. Milton patted Eddie's shoulder again and followed Scott's footsteps. "I know, wait for me." Eddie came back to his senses from the shock and hurriedly chased after him. "I didn't expect," he said in a surprised tone. "The lady looked like a fragile item like porcelain, but Scott said she was not easy to mess with." "This is not a Muggle society, Eddie." Scott said a few more words because Eddie always had a sense of propriety. "Regarding your little hobbies, although they are harmless most of the time, you should remember when you should shut up. In addition, the lady is not simply not easy to mess with, she..." Scott lowered his voice and said another sentence, causing Eddie and Milton to change their faces at the same time. What happened that day was just a small episode in Scott's study life, and he quickly put it behind his mind. Although he saw through the nature of Miss Travers at a glance. In his perception, her magic state is completely different from that of ordinary little wizards. Wizards who have killed people with their own hands will have some subtle changes in magic. This change cannot be hidden. This is a point that Scott discovered after awakening his magic perception and observing many wizards. If he were asked to draw an oil painting depicting magic for Miss Travers, there would definitely be a black and red scar on the picture. It would not be very conspicuous, but it would be a bit abrupt. Scott did not want to explore why an 11-year-old girl had killed someone. He is not an Auror. As long as she does not provoke him, he will not have the leisure to care about things that have nothing to do with him. But when he saw the girl, Scott would inevitably think of Professor Flitwick. The professor has never killed anyone, which actually surprised Scott. At noon that day, Scott and his two roommates walked out of the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom and prepared to go to the auditorium for lunch. Milton. In the corridor, Scott and Roger turned around and were surprised when they noticed that Milton had not kept up with them. At this time, Milton was opening his empty eyes, moving slowly and listlessly. His long and smooth hair was a little messy, and the whole person looked like a soulless corpse. The Hufflepuff students who had just been in class walked past him and couldn't help but chuckled a few times. "Hey, cheer up, Milton." Roger walked back and put his hand on Milton's shoulder, leading him to walk quickly. Scott smiled helplessly and followed. In the class just now, Professor Lockhart asked Milton to stand in front of the classroom to play the female ghost in the book, breaking up with the female ghost. The reason was because Milton had the smoothest long hair in the whole classroom. Now it seems that this performance in class has dealt a big blow to Milton. "I had a hunch," Roger complained loudly. "What I said on the train has come true, Scott. Our Professor Lockhart is indeed worse at being a professor than Quirrell." A Ravenclaw walking next to him immediately echoed loudly, "You were right, Roger. Look at what that idiot did in class. Huh, there is no magic theory, no magic practice, only a stupid stage play." At this time, Milton couldn't help but let out a loud sob. "Oh, I'm not talking about you, Milton." The boy who spoke quickly added, "I mean, well, anyway, your performance is still great." "Forget it, Dylan." A girl came over angrily. "Lockhart is useless, Merlin. You know, I was looking forward to him before school started. Because his novels are well written. Poor Milton, you should just reject him next time." Hearing her remarks, several Hufflepuff girls passing by immediately quit. "Kayla White, how dare you say bad things about Professor Lockhart behind his back? Professor Lockhart just hasn't adapted yet. Do you know how hard Professor Lockhart works? Look at the masterpieces in your hands." Of course what Kayla said is right. "You idiots." Dylan quickly stood in front of Kayla, and several people started arguing. Scott watched this scene and immediately pulled Roger and Milton away in a hurry. "I can't believe that Lockhart has so many admirers." Roger made a vomiting expression. Those girls must have been blinded by his idiotic smile. "He is really good at packaging himself." Seeing that Milton was not in high spirits, Scott consoled him. "Milton, maybe you would rather leave everyone's sight for a while. You can go back to the dormitory and have a good rest." Roger also said, "Don't worry, we will pack lunch for you." Milton sobbed again. "Oh, yes, I need to stay away from people's sight for a while, thank you." After thanking him, he hurriedly ran towards the Ravenclaw Tower. Scott looked at his back and said to Roger, "Lockhart seems to be used to targeting someone. As far as I know, a second-year Gryffindor student laughed at his Cornish elf in the first defense against the dark arts class, which led to him being called by him to perform a staged play in every class afterwards. Milton doesn't seem to have offended him." Roger was a little confused. "No, Milton has offended him," Scott said helplessly. "Milton thinks Lockhart's class has tarnished the art of stage play. You know, he is always not good at hiding his emotions. Lockhart should have seen his look. That look." Roger's face changed. "I understand, it is Milton's contempt. He has also endured Milton's look, and it is still fresh in his memory. Roger, whether for Milton himself or for the tranquility of our dormitory." Scott patted Roger on the shoulder. "Please take the initiative to replace Milton in the next defense against the dark arts class." "Why me?" "Because you are the most handsome of the 4 boys in our dormitory." "Oh, since you said so. Okay." As the two walked into the auditorium, Scott suddenly stopped and looked down at the bottom of the stairs in the foyer. "What's wrong?" Roger followed Scott's eyes, and then clicked his tongue in surprise. "Huh, that boy is a freshman, right?" He actually stood close to 3 girls and whispered to each other. "Maybe his number of ex-girlfriends will soon exceed mine. Something is abnormal." Scott's eyes were slightly cold. Jacob Kent, Caitlin Rohr. If you still remember, these 2 freshmen had a conflict on the first day of school, and Caitlin Rohr pointed out Jacob Burkent pushed her down the spiral staircase of Ravenclaw Tower. Roger said in surprise, "But now these 2 people are actually playing together. Plus 2 Slytherin female students." Scott already frowned. "That blonde Slytherin girl is Jasmine Travers." "Is her?" A look of surprise appeared on Roger's face. Of course Eddie couldn't help but tell Roger later on about Scott's cryptic comments about Jasmine Travers. He asked Scott, "What do you mean?" I'm afraid what happened on the first day of school was not that simple. Scott said, that girl, Jasmine Travers, that incident may have something to do with her. At this moment, Travers, who was at the bottom of the stairs, suddenly raised his head and met Scott's eyes again. Scott didn't pay attention to the polite and distant smile on the girl's face. At this moment, his eyes seemed to penetrate her pupils and see into her heart. The girl immediately put away her smile and lowered her head to avoid Scott's gaze. Jacob. Scott called the boy's name. Mr. Trollope. Jacob raised his head and greeted Scott politely. It's lunchtime, Scott said. Yes, thank you for the reminder. Jacob laughed. Looking at the expression on the boy's face, Scott lowered his eyelids and said no more. He just nodded and turned around and walked into the auditorium. What's wrong? Roger followed him and asked him in a low voice. The boy has changed, Scott whispered without any end, and walked straight to the long table belonging to Ravenclaw and sat down. Roger sat down next to him. Scott. We'll talk about it later. Scott shook his head and started eating. However, the crease between his eyebrows never disappeared. In the dormitory that night, Scott sat on a blue velvet single sofa by the window in his pajamas, playing with a silver-gray metal block in his hand. Scott. Roger came over and sat directly on the windowsill. You must have discovered something at noon. He said affirmatively. I must say, you didn't look very good at that time. Scott understood that he was talking about the two Ravenclaw freshmen, Jacob Kent and Caitlin Rohr. The two people who had had huge conflicts for a long time seemed to have reconciled, and they were even seen hanging out with Slytherin's Jasmine Travers at noon. He was about to speak when Eddie, who was already lying on the bed on the other side, suddenly sat up and asked, "What's wrong? What happened?" Milton, another member of this dormitory, also opened his already tight bed curtains. He was still feeling sad because of his humiliation in the defense against the dark arts class, but now he raised his head and asked the two of them, at noon. What happened after I left? But when you returned to the dormitory at noon but said nothing. Of course, unlike Eddie, whose face was full of desire for gossip, Milton's somewhat haggard face was only filled with concern for his friends. Facing the questions from the other two roommates, Roger hesitated to speak at first, and then looked at Scott again. Scott nodded to him with helplessness on his face. As such that, Roger immediately stood up and walked to the center of the dormitory, and began to vividly describe to Eddie and Milton the unusual scene he saw at noon. Listening to Roger's story, Milton gradually frowned, but Eddie let out several exclamations one after another. When Roger finished speaking, the three people turned to look at Scott together. Quote. Facing the three pairs of eyes with different expressions, Scott didn't want to speak for a while. Quote. However, the three roommates continued to stare at him persistently. Scott sighed secretly and said to them, "This matter seems a bit complicated and troublesome. Are you sure you want to take care of it?" No. Eddie shook his head first. This matter is related to the poison doll, lady. You have already warned me. Scott laughed. Since being sternly warned by him, that kid Eddie has started to refer to Jasmine Travers as a poison doll, in order to avoid accidentally spilling the beans. And Travert and Roll, listen to those last names. Eddie shrugged, a funny look on his face. Two of the great, 28 pureblood families. Merlin, I'm just a little muggle-born wizard, and I can't afford to cause trouble for such a pureblood. Roger smiled and said, and Morgan Avery, Jasmine Travers' Slytherin companion. He followed Eddie's example and shrugged his shoulders. He is also one of the great, 28 pureblood families. But Milton got up from the bed, put on his slippers and sat on the edge of the bed, tying his long hair casually. He said worriedly, Kent and Rohr are our new students in Ravenclaw House after all. What if they are bullied by Slytherin? Especially Kent, he is also a muggle-born little wizard. Eddie, who was the most knowledgeable, added, looking at Scott again. Kent. Scott recalled seeing Jacob Kent at noon. Compared to the poor boy who met him in the common room on the first morning of the new term, it was obvious that the boy had changed a lot. Even the magic he perceived was very different. If there weren't some parts that hadn't changed, he might have thought that the boy he saw was someone else who drank Polyjuice potion and pretended to be him. That boy, I gave him a chance to ask for help. Scott said to Roger, if he was forced, he should have followed my instructions and went to the auditorium with us immediately. He is not the kind of warm-hearted and kind-hearted person who helps others casually. This level is already the limit. But I remember you also said that the boy has changed. Roger said, although I don't know what happened, maybe the boy's change is also related to Miss Poison Doll. It is indeed possible. Scott did not deny it. He knew very well that if a wizard's magic power changed greatly in a short period of time, it was most likely because he had practiced some kind of black magic. But he didn't say it. Jacob Kent is a young muggle-born wizard who has just entered school. I'm afraid no one can believe that he has the ability to practice black magic within a short period of time after enrolling. Roger continued. Although Ravenclaw has generally remained neutral in the struggle between Slytherin and Gryffindor, if Miss Slytherin's Poison Doll has put her poisonous hand in Ravenclaw, we must respond as quickly as possible. As he spoke, he moved closer to Scott, shamelessly leaned on the armrest of the sofa, and pretended to squeeze his shoulders. So what should we do? Please make a decision quickly. The uncrowned king of room 16 of the male dormitory of Ravenclaw Academy, Mr. Trollope. When did I get such a long and uncool title? Scott was dumbfounded. He wanted to smash Roger's head with the metal block in his hand. I just came up with it. Roger's hand on his shoulder became more and more vigorous. In order to deal with the poisonous hand that secretly reached out from Slytherin, I decided to recommend you as the commander of this operation to lead us to victory. Quote. Go away. Scott broke away from Roger's hand and looked at the three roommates seriously. So, what exactly do you want to do? Of course everything will be subject to your decision, Mr. Trollope. Roger said, still pretending. Eddie and Milton nodded in agreement. Yes, I choose to listen to you too, Scott. Me too. Tisk, you cunning guys. Scott couldn't help but laughed and cursed. After pondering for a moment, he said to his roommates, although I don't know what role Travers played in the incident on the first night of school, it is very likely that the incident has something to do with her. He tossed the piece of metal in his hand. But we don't have to do anything specifically next. Let's keep an eye on these new students, Eddie. To be honest, I'm also a little curious, what exactly will Miss Travers do? Scott thought of the girl's eyes when their eyes met twice. Those silver-gray eyes inadvertently revealed the deep-hidden cruelty and viciousness. I see. Eddie climbed out of bed excitedly and patted his chest confidently. Leave the matter of gathering information to me. In the days that followed, Scott saw Jacob Kent hanging out with a few girls several times. In order to confirm his thoughts, Scott still took the initiative to greet him twice. He was sure that the boy actually understood his intention to greet him, but the boy dealt with it perfunctorily every time. So Scott never greeted him again after that. Counting it up, he had given the boy 3 chances to ask for help, but the other party did not seem to want to seek help. In his opinion, this already showed that the other party was voluntarily hanging out with those girls. So Scott naturally stopped taking this matter to heart. But when the time came to a certain day at the end of September, Eddie suddenly announced in the dormitory that he had discovered more about that thing. At that time, Scott did not react for a while to what he was referring to by that thing. Until Eddie walked up to him and said excitedly, Scott, you were right. Miss Poison Doll is really not simple. Huh. Scott then realized what Eddie was talking about. He immediately adjusted his expression and asked him calmly, very good, Eddie, tell me what you found. Eddie looked at him with doubtful eyes. You haven't forgotten about it, have you? Scott, it was obviously the task you gave me at that time. Why do you say that? Scott showed a surprised expression. I have been waiting for your progress, Eddie. No, it's not just you. Eddie's tone was full of distrust. I suddenly remembered that you haven't asked me about any progress in this matter during this period. At this time, Roger, who was standing behind Eddie, looked at Scott with a guilty look. He hurried over and put his hand on Eddie's shoulder intimately. Of course we won't keep asking about your progress, because we know that you are undoubtedly a genius in digging out information, Eddie, we all believe in you. Really? Eddie turned his head and stared at him with doubtful eyes. Of course. Roger nodded without changing his face. Milton. Eddie suddenly turned around, trying to find the person in this dormitory who was the least likely to lie and the least likely to pretend. At this time, Scott and Roger began to panic and looked at Milton's bed. Swish. Milton, who knew his own shortcomings, quickly pulled the bed curtains. His unstable voice came through the blue flannel. Sorry. I seem to be a little sleepy. Scott and Roger were helpless. As expected of Milton, his guilty voice had betrayed them. Oh, since Milton is tired, let's not disturb him to rest. Roger wanted to make amends. He put his arm around Eddie's neck again, took him to the windowsill, and then made him sit on the sofa. Eddie, who was a little bloated, could not resist the tall and strong Roger, so he could only sit down with a stinky face, and stared at Roger and Scott with resentful eyes. You just forgot. He leaned back on the sofa. I should have noticed it earlier. Milton, he suddenly said loudly with great pain, I thought you were the only one I could trust. I didn't expect you to be bad too. Yes, I'm sorry. Milton apologized faintly. Forget it. Eddie was a little scared when he heard Milton's tone, and quickly pointed the finger at the other two people. If you ask me, this is all your fault. It's not my fault. Roger began to shirk responsibility. You know, Eddie, I'm busy with Quidditch training in my spare time. Captain Bruce wants to get this year's Quidditch trophy before graduation. He pointed at Scott, and the commander of this matter is Scott. Quote. Scott sat on the bedpost and put down the small piece of ebony he was playing with. This matter, he said, I can explain it. Really. Eddie, who was sitting on the sofa, took a more arrogant posture and crossed his legs. Then please explain it, Mr. Trollope. I gave the boy 2 more chances to ask for help. Scott talked about his experience. Quote. Just like that, since he gave up, I didn't take it to heart. After all, everyone has to be responsible for every choice they make. At this point, Scott was already justified. Then did you forget one thing, Mr. Trollope? Eddie gritted his teeth and said, that is to inform your poor roommate Eddie Carmichael and tell him that he can give up the task. Oh, Eddie, I just can't bear to disturb your fun of digging secrets. I know you have always been addicted to it. Scott quickly changed the subject. Tell us quickly, what kind of news have you dug out? Yes, I remember you just said that you have made more discoveries. Roger also said, that must be amazing news. Huh, speaking of this, Eddie was immediately very proud, and his nose was about to turn up. Luckily, I'm here, Scott. He was so proud. This matter has exceeded your expectations. If I wasn't here, what would you do then? Scott took a deep breath and smiled kindly at Eddie. I see, then please tell us quickly. All right. Eddie immediately settled down. I said it before. You're right, Scott. What Miss Travers did secretly was amazing. Eddie revealed the secrets he had discovered. That first-year Slytherin student, Jasmine Travers, whom Eddie called the Poison Doll, actually managed to win over a large number of lower-grade girls in less than a month after the school started. Students gathered around her. These female students are generally first and second years, and most belong to Slytherin and Ravenclaw houses, with a small number of Hufflepuffs. Of course, there is no Gryffindor. Most of these female students come from ancient pure-blood families, or families where both parents are wizards. They secretly formed a secret society. Eddie pretended to be mysterious and whispered, the name is Afternoon Tea for Pure-Blood Girls. I heard that you made up the name of this club. Roger frowned, but that's not important. What's important is that since that girl has already won over so many students, the movement should not be small. How come no one noticed? Quote. They are all in contact with each other in private and secret ways. They have never been together on a large scale at the same time. Eddie said confidently, what Scott saw before was very close to Jacob Kent. Those girls should be the backbone of this club. Wait a minute, as a boy and born as a muggle, how did Jacob Kent get in? Roger was very surprised. Speaking of which, this kid is very powerful. No, Scott had a headache. What must be clarified now is that if the information Eddie inquired about is true, what exactly does Travers want to do? Become a new generation of Dark Lord. Don't say that. Roger's face suddenly turned pale. This kind of joke is not funny at all. Scott thought to himself, I'd rather make this a joke. You know, his top plan for this school year corresponds to Voldemort's diary and the basilisk in the Slytherin Chamber of Secrets. Who knows why there are such undercurrents in parts that are not described in the original work. That day, Scott and Roger were walking on a road outside Hogwarts Castle, preparing to go to the Care of Magical Creatures class located at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Among the 3 boys in the same grade in their dormitory, Milton did not choose this course. At this time, Scott noticed that the Weasley twins were sneaking up from behind them and stretched out his hands to hug their necks. He smiled and took a big step to avoid Fred's hand, but Roger was hugged by George. "Good morning." Fred, who failed to get his hands on him, shrugged his shoulders regretfully. George shouted into Roger's ear, "Ravenclaws." "Oh, spare me, Fred." Roger broke free from George's hand, rubbing his ears and slapping his robes. "Are you taking revenge?" Scott turned around and asked with a smile, "Weasleys." "Oh, don't be like that, Scott." Fred made a wronged expression. George immediately followed up. "Scott the Stingy, we are just a small revenge, but you let us share the same name with Percy. By the way, I am George, Roger." Scott looked at the muddy robes of the twins with disdain and asked, "Did you go to roll in a mud pit? Or have you forgotten how to use the cleansing spell?" As he said, he pulled out the wand from his arms and pointed it at Fred, "Clean up, Scourgify." "No." Fred dodged the spell quickly, "this is our medal. It is also the evidence of Wood's persecution of us," George said loudly. "Have you been training every day recently?" Roger asked. Fred nodded, "Yes, rain or shine, we think Wood has gone crazy. He will wake us up from our sleep before dawn every day," George said with a bitter face. "It seems that you Gryffindors are determined to win the Quidditch trophy this year." Roger smiled, "But I think the trophy will belong to Ravenclaw." Fred immediately sneered, "Oh, stop bragging, Roger. I remember that you Ravenclaws haven't won the Quidditch trophy for a long time." George made a contemptuous gesture. "Hey." Roger was unhappy, "this year's Ravenclaw will definitely surprise you." "Surprise us." Fred and George looked at each other and laughed at the same time. They quickly held Roger's hands on the left and right. "So, are the newcomers of Ravenclaw this year very powerful? Or did Bruce come up with a new formation? Tell us quickly, Roger." "No, let me go." Roger began to struggle desperately. "Give up, I will never tell you." "This is not up to you, he he he." The twins stretched out their evil hands at the same time, swam flexibly on Roger's body, and lit up and down. "Ha ha ha ha. Let me go, ha ha." Roger, who was tickled, laughed so hard that he couldn't stand steadily. "Gentlemen, class time is almost up." Scott, who was standing aside, reminded helplessly. He shook the book, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, in his hand. "If you are late, Professor Kettleburn will probably let you stay there to help him feed the flobberworms." After that, he turned and continued to walk towards the Forbidden Forest. "What are you busy with recently, Scott?" Fred immediately let go of Roger and pretended to walk to Scott's side seriously. George also threw away Roger, who was a little weak, and tidied his robe covered with mud. "It's been a month since school started, but we have never seen you in the wonderful night tour." Scott laughed at his persistence in the night tour. In fact, Scott, who had fully satisfied his curiosity in the night tour activities in the first and second grades, had completely lost his enthusiasm for this activity. Because it was not interesting. He suspected that the biggest reason why the twins were always keen on this night activity was that they enjoyed the battle of wits and courage with Filch. But his subsequent plan for the diary and the basilisk also required the participation of the twins, so he explained, "Sorry, I have a lot of papers to write recently, and I also have to attend the after-school club of Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall." "Oh, writing papers, attending after-school clubs. You are really a good student of Ravenclaw. Professor McGonagall's little baby." The twins began to sing some sarcastic words in unison again. "I know you have changed your mind, Scott. And we are still foolishly missing the good nights we spent together." "Shut up, what you said is so disgusting." Scott was almost choked by the words of these two guys. "It's a bit disgusting." Fred made a vomiting face and talked about other topics. "By the way, one of your Ravenclaw freshmen has become famous recently." George laughed and said, "Jacob Kent, known as Ravenclaw Davis too." "What happened?" Roger Davis. I was still confused at this time. Because many people saw that the boy was very close to several different girls. "Some people said that he was dating several girlfriends at the same time," said Fred. "This reminds me of you, Roger," George said. "After all, your speed of changing girlfriends is also very famous among Hogwarts students. You know, I have been single for 3 months this time." Roger protested loudly. Quote. Scott looked at his roommate speechlessly. So, do you want us to praise you? No, I just want to say that I am different from Jacob. Roger rubbed his hair in front of his forehead in a cool way. After all, I am a boy who is very loyal to feelings and will only date one girl at a time. Quote. This time, not only Scott, but even the twins were shocked by Roger's boasting and did not speak for a long time. After a long time, Fred frowned and said, "This kind of words that make people want to refute, but have no way to refute. To be honest, it's a bit disgusting. As expected of Davis I of Ravenclaw, we lost this time." George bowed to Roger pretentiously. Roger strode forward with his head held high and chest puffed out, but secretly winked at Scott when he passed him. Scott understood what he meant and nodded slightly without any expression. While chatting and laughing, several people came to the edge of the Forbidden Forest, and Professor Kettleburn, who was in charge of teaching this course, was already waiting there. The elderly professor only had one arm and half a leg left on his body. Even though he used prosthetic limbs for both legs, he had to rely on crutches to move around. "You are here." The old wizard was in good spirits. "Come and see, the course we are going to learn today is to know Cruppies. Krupp is a dog bred by wizards. It is very similar to Jack Russell Terrier, but the tail of Krupp is forked. This dog is extremely loyal to wizards, but very ferocious to muggles." After the course started, Professor Kettleburn asked the students to get acquainted with a young Krupp in groups of 4. These little guys can eat almost everything. Professor Kettleburn walked among the students with a staggering pace, bending down from time to time to touch the heads of the dogs lovingly. "Now, you can feed these little guys the food I prepared in advance and try to build relationships with them." Scott and Roger were in the same group with the Weasley twins. Professor Kettleburn assigned them a dark-haired puppy. At this time, they were squatting on the ground, surrounding the puppy in the middle. The puppy barked a little uneasily, obviously wary of them. Only when Professor Kettleburn stroked it would it happily shake its forked tail. "Oh, little guy." Fred frowned and used a branch to pick out some cow entrails from a small bucket beside him. "Want to eat, little guy?" The black puppy came over to sniff, and immediately pounced on it to eat heartily. "Look, the little guy's tail is wagging, which means he recognizes me." Fred was proud again. "I think we all need to get to know this little guy, so let's take turns feeding it." Roger also picked up a branch and put it into the barrel, stirring the disgusting entrails. A foul smell came to his face. Scott covered his nose and moved away 2 steps in disgust. "No, I don't need it." At this time, Professor Kettleburn asked the students loudly, "Can anyone tell me, if you want to legally raise a Krupp, what should you do to get a license issued by the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures?" Scott was excited. It's time for extra credit in class. In the spirit of not wasting time, he quickly raised his hand. "Then please." Professor Kettleburn glanced at the students who raised their hands, and finally called Scott's name. "Please ask Mr. Trollope to answer this question." "Good luck." Scott stood up with a triumphant smile. "Okay, Professor." He began to recite verbatim. "Any wizard who wants to apply to keep a Krupp must complete a simple test before obtaining a license from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. The owner of a Krupp is legally obliged to use a painless cutting spell to remove its peculiar tail when the Krupp is 6 to 8 weeks old, so as to prevent the Krupp from attracting the attention of muggles. In addition, wizards who want to keep Kruppies need to prove that they can control this breed in muggle-inhabited areas." "Well said, Mr. Trollope." Professor Kettleburn gave Scott a thumbs up with his only remaining hand. "I have nothing to add to this question, and for this, I will give Ravenclaw 10 points. This is Professor Kettleburn's routine in class. He would only ask one question in each class, and if the students answered the question correctly, he would use up the extra points for the class at one time. And these questions were usually not too difficult, and almost anyone who was called on could earn points. This made everyone raise their hands enthusiastically in the Care of Magical Creatures class. "The Kruppies you are meeting now are all 5-week-old little guys." Professor Kettleburn continued the class. "In the next 2 weeks, you should try to get familiar with them," he announced with some excitement. "After 2 weeks, you will remove their peculiar tails by yourself, using the painless cutting spell." When the students were in an uproar, Professor Kettleburn said loudly, so in these 2 weeks, you will not only learn to raise these little guys, but you must also review spells in your spare time, and you must ensure that there will be no accidents when you use the painless cutting spell. Oh, poor little guy. George immediately touched the puppy's tail with ill intentions. You are about to lose half of your tail. Unfortunately, the puppy was eating happily and did not realize his upcoming tragic fate. At the end of the class, Professor Kettleburn assigned an assignment about the history of wizards breeding cruppies. Painless cutting charm. Is that it? After class, on the way back to the castle, Fred said with a chuckle, while raising his wand. Diffindo. A bright pink light flew out from the tip of his wand, cutting off a branch in front of him. This is the cutting charm, but it may not be painless. Maybe you can try to use it to cut off Percy's nose and see if he will howl. George said. Good idea, Fred said excitedly. Without a nose, Percy can't dream of becoming the Minister of Magic, so our future may be much easier. At this point, he happily high-fived George with an eager expression on his face. Quote. Scott wanted to ask what kind of devil these two guys were, and once again felt deep sympathy for Percy in his heart. And, no nose or something, why does it sound so familiar? With two brothers like this, maybe Percy, who has no nose, may indeed give up his dream of being the Minister of Magic, and instead choose the more promising career of the Dark Lord. Professor Kettleburn may have made a mistake. We have not learned the painless cutting charm. I remember that it seems to be a spell used for clinical operations. It is probably only used by healers at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Maladies. Gotta be more. Roger was thinking about the books he had read. Perhaps we can go to the school hospital and ask Madame Pomfrey for help. No, we can't go to the campus hospital. Fred immediately shook his head desperately. George said in an accusatory tone, Madame Pomfrey strictly forbids us from going near her territory. Just because we gave Harry a toilet seat from the school toilet as a gift last school year when he was unconscious in the ward. Madame Pomfrey has listed us as no one to associate with. Unless we completely cut off our own limbs. Otherwise we won't be able to step into the campus hospital. Quote. Scott didn't know what to say. Every time he felt that these two guys were weird enough, but they would do something even weirder. Leave this matter to me and Roger. Scott said, I can also ask Professor Flitwick for advice, and we will teach you after we learn it. Roger said helplessly, let's do it. Thank you, Scott. Roger. May Merlin bless you. Fred and George started praising them loudly and exaggeratedly until they couldn't stand it anymore. It was another ordinary day. After finishing his classes, Scott opened the door of his dormitory. Good evening, Scott. Eddie was the only one in the dormitory, and he was carrying a huge backpack. Milton went to the classical music club, and Roger asked out another girl, Eddie said to Scott. And you're going to cheat again, Scott said. Eddie smiled flatteringly at him. Don't expose me, Scott, I just want to earn a little hard money. Scott shook his head, of course I won't go out of my way to expose you. But I want to remind you that I'm not the only one who can tell that the Buffy brain-boosting agent you sold last school year was actually Humizzi's feces. Quote. Oh, of course, many people have the ability to tell the authenticity of potions. Eddie said enthusiastically, but doing business also requires strategy and target selection. The customers I choose are all empty-headed. In order to deal with a young wizard who fell ill during an exam and sought medical treatment. He took off the backpack on his back and opened it on the bed. He kept saying, and your information is out of date. Buffy Brain Refresher is only a limited product during the exam season. What I brought this time is something completely new. He took out a small glass bottle from his backpack, shook it in his hand, and said in a proud tone, Special hair care potion, let your hair say goodbye to dryness and frizzy hair. Scott reached out and took the bottle of magic potion, opened it, smelled it, and said angrily, I'm sure this is just a Muggle brand of ginger conditioner, because my mother uses it. How is it? I spent a lot of money this time. This is not the same level of product as Humizzi's feces. At least it is really useful. Eddie was a little proud. I think many Muggle-born wizards know this. Scott handed the glass bottle back. If you are found out and beaten, I will not save you, Eddie. Eddie put the glass bottle back into his backpack and acted nonchalantly, it doesn't matter. I said you have to choose your target when doing business. This time I will sell the hair potion, to those who know nothing about the Muggle world. Or the little witch who doesn't care about cosmetics at all. Whatever. Scott shook his head and walked to the bookshelf next to his bed to take down an intermediate guide to transformation. You know, since the sparkling Professor Lockhart came to Hogwarts, some of the little witches who are fascinated by him have awakened their awareness of beauty. They are especially passionate about hair care. Eddie had that mouth that wouldn't stop easily. Especially some Gryffindor and Hufflepuff little witches. But they can't afford the bird snake egg yolk shampoo sold by Professor Lockhart, although Professor Lockhart has boasted about his shampoo many times. Lock in the shine. He put on his backpack again and patted his chest. It's up to me, the underground Ravenclaw businessman Etika Mitchell, to save their hair and their love for beauty. Okay Eddie, please shut up, I think I have to go to Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration Club. Scott didn't want to hear Eddie's business experience here. Oh, okay, do you need me to give you a few bottles? Eddie looked up at the smooth black curly hair on Scott's head. They can at least give your hair its own fragrance. I do not need it, thank you. Scott flatly refused. He walked directly out of the dormitory with the books and wand, while giving him a wary look. Don't even think about using my name for advertising. I don't want to suddenly get a weird reputation. Okay. Eddie glanced at him regretfully and followed his footsteps. Wait for me, I want to go out too. After walking out of the dormitory, Eddie still didn't stop talking. But it doesn't matter, Milton has accepted my gift. And his smooth long hair is more convincing than your naturally curly short hair. I dare say Milton has no idea what you want to do. He just happily accepted the gift from his friend. Scott couldn't help but look at him with contempt again. Eddie smiled shamelessly. What does it matter? It's just mutual benefit. Scott was too lazy to talk to him and just reminded him, you'd better not sell these things in Ravenclaw, otherwise I will not be optimistic about your future situation in the academy. Of course, I'm not that stupid, Eddie assured. But when the two passed by the common room, he immediately ran to a little witch sitting alone in front of the window. Good evening, Luna, Eddie greeted warmly. Good evening, Eddie. The little witch has dark golden brown hair and speaks in an erratic voice. She didn't look at Eddie when she spoke, but looked out the window motionlessly wearing a pair of strange glasses. Luna Lovegood is also a new student in Ravenclaw this year. This is a little witch who is not very gregarious. Even Scott occasionally heard others call her, crazy girl. But Scott noticed her not just because she was a named character in the originals. According to Eddie's latest information, Luna is the only little witch among the non-Muggle-born female students in the lower years of Ravenclaw who has not yet mixed up with Jasmine Travert. Of course, this also exacerbated her isolation among the girls. Oh Luna, maybe what I said will make you unhappy, Eddie said pretentiously, but I have to say objectively that your hair is indeed a little frizzy. Luna turned her head and reached out to take off her glasses. Really, she reached out and stroked her hair, revealing carrot-shaped earrings. I think it's okay. Her eyes were a little bulging and her eyebrows were very light, making her look surprised. But I think you can be better. Seeing that Eddie was about to sell his product to Luna, Scott walked over with a smile and reached out to grab the shoulder strap of Eddie's backpack. Eddie. He gave Eddie a warning look, and then said to Luna, don't listen to him, Miss Lovegood. I know you are Scott Trollope. I like the painting you gave to Professor Flitwick very much. Luna looked at Scott with a trance. Can I call you Scott? Of course. Scott smiled. By the way, Eddie likes to sell some harmless but useless gadgets. You'd better not believe anything he sells. Hey, Scott. Eddie looked at Scott in disbelief, his eyes full of accusations. Didn't you say you wouldn't expose me? Didn't you say you wouldn't sell in Ravenclaw? Scott gave him a meaningful look in return. Ha 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 ha. At this time, Luna suddenly laughed a little exaggeratedly. You were really funny, she said. You can also call me Luna, Scott. Okay, Luna, but we have to leave first, bye. Scott shook the book in his hand. Goodbye. Luna waved, turned around, put on the strange glasses and looked out the window. Let's go. Scott dragged Eddie, who looked resentful, out of the common room. Scott and Eddie separated after walking down Ravenclaw Tower together. Eddie embarked on the road of sales as an underground businessman with great ambition, while Scott carried the book to the second floor of the main building of Hogwarts Castle. Professor McGonagall's office is located next to the corridor on the second floor, so the Transfiguration Club she hosts is also located nearby in a small classroom on the other side of the corridor. Scott, who was walking in the corridor, heard someone calling his name and turned around to see Cedric climbing up the stairs. "Good evening, Cedric." Scott stopped. "Good evening." Cedric walked over quickly. "I don't know if I can ask you for advice." He looked hesitant. "Since the first charms class at the beginning of the school year, I have tried many times what you and Professor Flitwick said, to sense magic, but unfortunately I have never been able to." "What progress?" "Sense magic." Scott glanced at him in surprise. Cedric smiled shyly at him, his face turning slightly red. "Of course, it's okay if it's not convenient for you to say it." He quickly added as if he was afraid of embarrassing Scott. "It's not inconvenient." Scott shook his head. "Can I ask how far you can do it now?" "Of course," Cedric said happily. "I can only sense other people's magic fluctuations at close range now, especially when they are casting spells." He frowned slightly, "But I can't tell the difference between different people's magic powers." After hearing this, Scott thought for a while. He didn't know how to explain it to Cedric. Most of the reason why he is able to perceive clearly lies in his talent. After thinking about it, he chose to tell the truth to Cedric. "Sorry, Cedric. Regarding sensing magic, I actually can't clearly explain to you how to do it. It's not like a spell, there are no fixed spells and gestures. Because this kind of perception is like our vision and hearing, which we can master slowly and naturally from birth, just like following instinct. It doesn't matter, Scott. It's probably because I haven't learned enough about magic yet." Although Cedric was a little disappointed, he still didn't forget to thank him. "Thank you for telling me this, it gave me some inspiration." Seeing Cedric sincerely thank him, Scott couldn't help but sigh. This is such an honest boy, no wonder he was assigned to Hufflepuff by the Sorting Hat. "No need to thank me, Cedric." Scott inevitably felt a little embarrassed, so he decided to talk more. "Although I can't describe this ability clearly, I can tell you some methods to enhance your perception, which may be helpful to you." "Really?" Cedric was overjoyed. "I don't know how to thank you, Scott." Scott smiled. "You're welcome, it's only possible, because I discovered this method by coincidence, but I'm not sure if it will work for you too. It would be the greatest help if you could tell me the method you discovered." Cedric said gratefully. "Well, this is actually what I discovered during the in-depth study of transfiguration," Scott said. Cedric quickly listened to him carefully. "As you know, a truly sophisticated transfiguration technique is not just about changing the appearance of an object. After we achieve the first step, we hope to make the material of the object truly change as well." Scott talks about how he discovered that method. "So in the last school year, I collected a lot of things of different materials, different woods, different metals, or more complex objects, even some animals. I've been trying to use magic to perceive them." "Is this the training method you said?" Cedric understood what Scott meant. He is also a wizard who is quite talented in the art of transformation, and he has done similar exercises. "That's really how we started." At this point, Scott couldn't help but complain. "Speaking of which, I made a lot of useless efforts at first. I failed to understand at the time that magic and Muggle science are completely different. Later I realized that all magic is based on magic. I don't need to use my brain to remember what elements those different materials are made of, or think about complex issues such as what molecules and atoms they are." In Cedric's confused eyes, Scott continued, "I just need to use my own magic power to remember that feeling. Different items present different feelings in the perception of magic power. Follow this when using transfiguration. The feeling in the memory can successfully change their texture." Cedric could understand here, and he nodded quickly. Scott suddenly laughed a little and stopped. He seemed to have forgotten just now that Cedric, who was completely ignorant of science, could not understand this, and it was meaningless to talk to him. When he first learned magic, his thinking had not yet changed, so he habitually used scientific thinking to treat magic. The result was of course that he retreated to different directions. This is a bit like when he was learning English in his previous life. When he saw an English word, he always habitually translated it into Chinese in his mind. Putting the past behind him, Scott finally got to the point. "I believe you have done similar exercises, but maybe you can start with the simplest material like me. For example, a piece of willow wood, a piece of fine iron. I have collected a lot of different materials. I have been holding them in my hands, touching them with magic, and feeling the difference between them. Also, use transfiguration to constantly try to change them. Feel the difference between the materials you transform and the natural materials, and then adjust them little by little. It's probably like this at the beginning, and then just increase the difficulty slowly according to your own progress. Scott thought about it again and found that there was nothing to add. In short, in this process, my perception of magic naturally became clearer. Is that so? Cedric was thoughtful when he heard this, and he looked at Scott with some admiration. It seems that you are indeed working harder than me, Scott. I did this out of interest. Scott didn't care. However, this process may be very boring for people who are not interested. It doesn't matter, I am also interested. Cedric laughed. It seems that I should start collecting different materials. He thanked him seriously again. Anyway, I am very grateful for telling me this, Scott. You're welcome. This may not be useful to you. Scott patted his shoulder. Don't blame me if you try it and find it doesn't work. Of course not, Cedric said seriously. Even if it doesn't help with my perception of magic, it can at least help me improve my transfiguration, right? Indeed, Scott nodded. Gentlemen. At this moment, the door of the classroom next to the two was pushed open, and Professor McGonagall came out and stood at the door. I think our Transfiguration Club activities have begun. She pursed her lips a little sternly. I wonder why the two gentlemen you have been waiting for are still standing at the door of the club and not coming in. Professor McGonagall suddenly appeared, and Scott and Cedric finally reacted. The two of them were standing at the door of the Transfiguration Club classroom and were so engrossed in talking that they forgot the time. Sorry, Professor McGonagall. Facing Professor McGonagall's slightly stern eyes, the two of them did not find excuses, but lowered their heads and admitted their mistakes. Professor McGonagall did not care much about Scott and Cedric, two good students, but looked at them with a warning and turned into the classroom. Come in quickly, Mr. Trollope and Mr. Diggory. Scott and Cedric hurriedly followed into the classroom and closed the door. Then, the two of them quickly found their seats and sat down under the good and bad eyes of other students. It's really strange, Cedric and Scott, you two good boys are also late. A girl sitting next to them said jokingly. Angelina Johnson, a Gryffindor girl in the same grade as them, is also a chaser of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Scott whispered, "This is an accident, Angelina." Angelina smiled, and when she wanted to say something else, Professor McGonagall, who was standing in front of the classroom, looked over with sharp eyes, so she quickly shut up. Our first topic today, Professor McGonagall held a magazine in her hand, is to read and discuss a paper published in the latest issue of Transfiguration Today. The stern look on her face eased. Even I was inspired by this paper. At this point, the stern look on her face had completely disappeared, and she couldn't help but smile with pride. The author of this paper is Bill Weasley, one of Gryffindor's best students. Scott was a little surprised to hear this. Bill Weasley. Scott remembered that the Weasley twins had mentioned that the oldest brother of their family should have gone to Gringotts Wizarding Bank in Egypt as a curse breaker after graduating from Hogwarts. A wizard who can serve as a curse breaker must generally be the best at magic skills such as arithmetic divination, spells, and ancient magic. Unexpectedly, now it seems that Bill Weasley is also quite interested in transfiguration even after work. He is indeed a powerful person who once obtained 12 certificates in the OWL's exam. Start reading now. Professor McGonagall put down the magazine. Students who have read it before, you can take a closer look, or think about the content of your speech in the discussion later. The students immediately moved after hearing this, either opening their magazines and notebooks, or standing up to take new magazines from the bookshelf on the wall of the classroom. Scott, who was sitting next to the bookshelf, turned around and took down 2 copies of Transfiguration Today, and handed one to Cedric. Thank you. Cedric took it and opened it impatiently. Scott also opened the magazine. It seems that you haven't had time to read the latest issue of the magazine. The Transfiguration Today magazine in the Transfiguration Club was applied for by Professor McGonagall and subscribed by the school. In addition, the Hogwarts library will also subscribe some. It is precisely because the club and the library have this magazine that Scott did not subscribe another copy with his own money. This also led to him often not reading it in the first place. Yes, I've been busy with Quidditch training recently. Cedric quickly found the paper that Professor McGonagall mentioned through the magazine catalog and couldn't wait to read it carefully. Scott also turned to that page and saw the title of the paper at first glance, A Conjecture, Maybe We Can Make Transformation More Complicated. Transfiguration Today is an academic journal that focuses on the latest developments in the field of transfiguration. This journal will publish some articles and papers by some outstanding and knowledgeable scholars in this field. Moreover, this magazine will also select the Transfiguration Today Most Potential Newcomer Award, which will be awarded to Hogwarts students who are particularly good at transfiguration. Professor McGonagall has complained more than once in the activities of the Transfiguration Club that no student in Hogwarts has won this award for several years. And whenever she talked about this topic, she would deliberately look at Scott, which made Scott panic. Although Scott showed a superior talent in the study of transfiguration, he had never published a paper in a magazine. Professor McGonagall had also given him advice, hoping that he could work hard to find a direction to write some papers to publish in order to compete for the Most Promising Newcomer Award, but Scott politely rejected it, because this was inconsistent with Scott's own ideas. In the past 3 academic years, Scott's learning content of transfiguration has never deviated from the content of the textbook. It's just that in these contents, he has learned much more deeply than ordinary students. Many students only pursue the state of being able to do it when learning magic. If a spell can be successfully cast, they think they have learned it. But Scott doesn't think so. He not only requires himself to be able to do it, but also to do it well, and even always pursues better. In Scott's view, this is part of laying the foundation, and he must lay a solid foundation. And these basic knowledge cannot support him to write papers that can be published or even win awards. If he wanted to publish an award-winning paper, Scott had to study some new and eye-catching topics. He was unwilling to break his study plan for a magazine's newcomer award. In his opinion, he was on a path of accumulation, and now he was still in the accumulation stage. The Transfiguration Club classroom was quiet, with only the sound of pages turning and feather pens scratching parchment. Scott could no longer hear any sound at this time, and his eyes were firmly attracted by the paper in front of him. As he read carefully, his eyes became brighter and brighter, and his heart became more and more excited. This paper inspired him greatly, and some of his views coincided with some of his unverified assumptions. After reading the paper, Scott gradually calmed down and looked at the title of the paper again, A Conjecture, Maybe We Can Make Transformation More Complicated. After reading the paper, Scott understood that the author of the paper, Bill Weasley, did only expound a conjecture in this paper. Although the author provided some evidence for this conjecture based on his own experience in Egypt. But these evidences are not 100% convincing. So this is really just a conjecture. Even the editor-in-chief of the magazine, Transfiguration Today, only commented at the end of the paper that this conjecture is interesting enough. From his words, we can see that he is not optimistic about the realization of this conjecture. But Scott felt for no reason that this conjecture has great realization value and is not impossible to realize. He wanted to continue researching along this conjecture. Time passed quickly, and after Professor McGonagall saw that all the students had finished reading the paper, she waved the wand in her hand. The wand made a soft crackling sound, attracting everyone's attention. I saw that all the students had read the paper. Professor McGonagall lowered her right hand holding her wand. Now we can start a free discussion and everyone can share their thoughts on the content of this paper. That's a curious idea, Professor. Angelina was the first to speak, looking at her notebook as she spoke. Scott saw that the page of her notebook was filled with words written in messy handwriting. A very bold idea, and very interesting, Angelina said, shaking her head again, but I have to say, Mr. Weasley's idea may be too wild. She drew a few circles on the notebook with the quill in her hand. Although I just verified it theoretically, I don't seem to see the possibility of realizing this idea. After listening to her speech, Professor McGonagall just nodded without commenting. What about others? Do you have different ideas from Miss Johnson? I'd like to share my opinion, Professor. Scott heard the sound and looked over, finding that it was Percy Weasley who was standing up. Please, Mr. Weasley. Professor McGonagall extended her hand. I'm not saying this because Bill is my brother, but I think the ideas presented in this paper are not completely impossible to achieve. Percy listed several points of support given in the paper. The mysterious Egyptian magic world hides a lot of ancient magic knowledge that is unfamiliar to us. I think that although the conjecture in the paper cannot be verified with the magic knowledge we have learned so far, it is very likely that the Egyptians have realized it in ancient times. Watching Percy's performance, Scott was surprised again. He could tell that Percy actually admired his eldest brother. If you think about Percy's character, you will know that Bill Weasley is really amazing. Professor McGonagall nodded again and motioned for Percy to sit down. Where are the others? She looked at the other students in the classroom. Then, other members of the Transfiguration Club also stood up to express their opinions. It's just that most of the students' statements were similar to what Angelina said. They think that the conjecture in the paper is indeed interesting and can give them some inspiration, but they think that this conjecture can only stay in the conjecture stage in the end. Even the few students who expressed different opinions only echoed Percy's words. They believe that this conjectured magic may indeed have existed in ancient times, but they also believe that it is impossible to reproduce it in modern times when ancient magic has lost a lot of inheritance. I think the conjecture elaborated in this paper is actually replacing the role of alchemy with transfiguration. Cedric was talking. On the basis of the transfiguration technique, the idea of using ancient magic texts and spells to enhance the power of the transfiguration technique is not 100% impossible in strict theory. But I think the difficulty involved in it is probably something no wizard can do, arrive. We all know that when we use magic, just the superposition of two simple spells can stump most wizards. Not to mention integrating different systems of magic such as transfiguration, spells, and ancient runes. I think such difficulty will make people feel desperate. He held up his notebook and showed the dense writing on it. I'm just theoretically enumerating the magical knowledge required to achieve this conjecture. Of course, this is only what I can think of. He said helplessly, I don't know how to implement more parts. He put down his notebook. To be honest, just this alone scares me. He looked up at Professor McGonagall again. Suppose, even if all the problems are solved in theory, I don't think anyone can use it smoothly in practice. Quote, maybe if it was Merlin. He joked at the end, then laughed to himself. Professor McGonagall also raised her lips when she heard this. She nodded to Cedric and then looked at Scott. That's the last one. What do you think, Mr. Trollope? I am interested in both this paper and its author, Professor. Scott stood up and smiled. I will write to Mr. Weasley, the author of the paper. He looked back at Percy. There are 5 Weasleys in Gryffindor now. Anyone can be welcome. I hope you can introduce them to me. Many people in the classroom laughed, even Percy laughed, and he gave Scott a no-problem gesture. I think what you need is to express your opinion about the paper, Mr. Trollope, said Professor McGonagall, rather than to state your plans for pursuing the author of the paper. Ha 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 ha. At this moment, everyone else couldn't help laughing. Well, Scott looked at Professor McGonagall's smiling eyes with resentment, but he was choked. I didn't expect you to be such a Professor McGonagall. Snort. As expected of you, Yingailan. All right. When the laughter stopped, Scott continued. To be honest, I have had the same idea as this paper. There were a few boos in the classroom. Scott ignored it. Of course, that's just my fantasy, and there is no actual basis. So when I saw this paper, I was very excited. After all, Mr. Weasley's paper is much better than my daydream. At least he listed some evidence. Scott paused here. Theoretical alchemy can't achieve such a perfect effect for the magical creations left in the ancient Egyptian pyramids, but theoretically perfect transfiguration can. At this point, his eyes revealed a strong emotion, which was greed and desire for knowledge. I understand your excitement, Mr. Trollope. The smile on Professor McGonagall's face had disappeared, but I suggest that you just broaden your horizons through other people's papers and get some inspiration, but I don't think it's a good thing for you to indulge in it. She didn't want to listen to Scott anymore, so she stretched out her hand and pressed her palm, motioning Scott to sit down. Yes, Professor. Scott shut up obediently and sat down obediently. The discussion about this paper came to an end. Next, Professor McGonagall began to teach the members of the Transfiguration Club some useful tips for using transfiguration. Scott quickly put aside the paper and listened carefully. When the club activities ended that day, Professor McGonagall asked Scott to stay. Chapter 21. Professor McGonagall waved her wand, and everything in the Transfiguration Club classroom immediately returned to order. Do you know why I left you alone, Mr. Trollope? She looked at Scott standing aside. Please rest assured, Professor. Scott assured, I have never studied in depth anything outside the textbook so far. Professor McGonagall looked into his eyes, but you are very interested in Mr. Weasley's theory. I am indeed very interested in the conjectures Mr. Weasley expounded in his paper. Scott looked at Professor McGonagall without dodging his eyes, but I will not study in depth in this area before I have thoroughly mastered the knowledge within the scope of the school curriculum. That's good, I believe you, Mr. Trollope. Professor McGonagall retracted her gaze first. Having taught Scott for 3 years, she still knows this student's usual learning goals very well. She knows that he attaches great importance to the basics. Let's stop here today. Professor McGonagall turned around and walked out of the club classroom first. Scott also walked out of the classroom and said goodnight to Professor McGonagall in the corridor. By the way, Professor McGonagall stopped again as she turned around. Mr. Trollope. Professor. Scott also stopped walking. Professor Flitwick has shown off to me more than once the birthday gift you gave him in advance. And if I remember correctly, his birthday is October 17th. Professor McGonagall suddenly blinked mischievously. But I want to remind you, Mr. Trollope, your Transfiguration professor's birthday is more than 10 days earlier than your Charms professor's birthday. After saying this, she walked into her office without looking back. Only Scott, who was a little dumbfounded, was left standing alone in the corridor. Alas, why do the professors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry like to compare so much? Obviously, they are all not young anymore. Scott shook his head and turned to walk towards the stairs. Since Professor McGonagall reminded him like this, it seems that he must prepare a gift with the same care to make sense. What's more, forgetting Professor McGonagall's birthday was originally his mistake. But more importantly, he thought about it carefully. It was only 5 days away from Professor McGonagall's birthday on October 4th. So, what should I give? Scott thought as he walked. If I still give Professor McGonagall a painting with the same theme, would it be too perfunctory? After all, he also knew that Professor McGonagall had been taking good care of him for the past 3 years, and his teaching of Transfiguration had already exceeded the scope of the school professor's duties. In fact, in the eyes of Scott, who was a Chinese in his previous life, this was already the difference between a disciple and a student. If Scott had just given the professors a gift at Christmas like in previous years, it would have been fine. But this time he was eager to show off, and found an excuse for a birthday gift to give the painting to Professor Flitwick. No wonder Professor McGonagall felt a little unbalanced. As a student, being too popular with professors is also a kind of distress. Scott thought narcissistically and walked down the stairs quickly. Meow. At this time, a cat's cry came, and Scott's face immediately became bad, and he couldn't help but curl his lips. As expected, Filch strode over from the corridor on the first floor with his ugly, skinny cat, Mrs. Norris. The magic lamp in his hand illuminated the 2 identical bulging eyes of the man and the cat. It's almost curfew, Trollope. Filch smiled maliciously at Scott, revealing his ugly teeth. You'd better run back to the Ravenclaw common room as soon as possible, or you will be in detention from tomorrow. Although Scott had never been caught by Filch in the past night walks, and had basically never dealt with him, he was not surprised by Filch's malice at this moment. Because he knew that this old squib hated everyone who could learn magic from the bottom of his heart. Curfew is coming soon, but it's not here yet, is it? Scott gave Filch an obvious fake smile and quickened his pace to pass by him and Mrs. Norris. Filch's angry voice came from behind. I will catch you if you don't return to the Ravenclaw common room on time. Oh, if you can do it, Scott replied nonchalantly. Although the curfew was indeed very close, he did not obey Filch's words and ran. Because even if he really wandered at night, Filch could not catch him. But at this time, he was still troubled by the preparation of birthday gifts and had no interest in wandering at night. But when he walked out of the main building of the castle and passed by the courtyard, he stopped again. Come out, he said to the monster stone sculpture in the courtyard. Fred, George, 2 identical figures immediately walked out from behind the stone sculpture, one on the left and one on the right. You are worthy of it. Ravenclaw's hound. When did I get such an ugly nickname? Scott gritted his teeth and glared at them. It must be you who just gave it to me. Not us, Fred shouted in injustice. It came from Ravenclaw these days. George added. Why don't I know? Scott frowned. He always felt that he was quite popular in Ravenclaw, and no one would maliciously give him such a nickname. We don't know who gave you such a nickname. Maybe you could check it out yourself. Fred and George spread their hands together and looked at him with innocent expressions. Or come on, Eddie. He must know, but he didn't tell you. That's right, Eddie. Scott nodded in agreement. The boy must have known this nickname, but he didn't remind him at all. Scott decided to settle the score with him first when he went back. Goodbye then, you two. Scott waved his hand, turned and left. It's a nice night and curfew is coming up. Won't you join us on a fun adventure? The twins ran after him inviting him. No, I hope you have fun. Scott rejected them without mercy. Then don't blame us. Quote. I won't help you write a letter to introduce you to Bill. The twins smiled and said that although they did not join the Transfiguration Club, they were obviously very well informed. Scott kept walking after hearing this. It's okay, Percy has promised to help me. Percy. Fred sighed exaggeratedly. George said proudly. Obviously, Bill still likes us more than Percy. Scott fell on deaf ears, now more interested in knowing who gave him the dog nickname. But the twins kept chattering in his ears. And were not so sure Mom and Dad would be okay with Bill getting a boyfriend. Maybe we can help you convince them. Scott felt that the veins on his forehead were beating actively, and he couldn't bear it and took out the wand from his arms. However, when he turned around, the twins immediately ran away laughing. Scott took a deep breath. Very good, this is very Yingling. He walked towards Ravenclaw Tower in a hurry, suddenly wanting to find a girlfriend as soon as possible. On the way, Scott, who was stimulated, had already forgotten about preparing gifts, and was thinking about how to find a girlfriend as soon as possible to have a sweet love. So he carefully recalled all the girls he knew, but found that his current situation seemed a bit awkward. Speaking of which, if it was the sum of his past and present lives, he was already in his 30s. But he was indeed only 14 years old now. The inequality between physical age and psychological age caused the embarrassing situation. He couldn't like girls of the same age or younger like a normal boy. But if it was a girl older than him, it was highly likely that she would not like him. He even felt that the eyes of those girls in the 6th and 7th grades looked at the boys in the lower grades as if they were looking at monkeys. Forget it, let it go. Scott thought sadly and soon walked to the vicinity of Ravenclaw Tower. A gust of evening breeze blew, and the chaotic thoughts in Scott's mind suddenly dissipated a lot. He remembered that he had two more important things to do at the moment. One thing is to settle accounts with Eddie as soon as possible and find out the culprit who gave him a nickname behind his back. The other thing is to prepare Professor McGonagall's birthday gift as soon as possible. Scott walked into the Ravenclaw Tower without stopping, but stopped again when he stepped onto the spiral staircase. He sensed the magic of two students, who were hiding outside the Ravenclaw Tower, in the corner where the tower and the main building of the castle meet. Jasmine Travers and Caitlin Rowe. One is a first-year Slytherin girl who made Scott a little wary and is very good at disguise. The other is a first-year Ravenclaw girl who had a conflict with Jacob Kent and was too close to Travers. Combined with the information Eddie found out later, Scott and his roommates have been secretly paying attention to these two little witches and their pure-blood girl group recently. It's curfew time now, but these two girls are hiding in the dark, which is obviously very suspicious. Since they met by chance, Scott decided to find out for himself. Scott took out his wand from his bosom, and whispered a spell while turning his wrist, and pointed the tip of the wand at himself. In an instant, the color and texture of his body became exactly the same as the surrounding environment. After using the disillusionment charm to completely blend himself into the environment, Scott waved his wand again and used a quietus charm. Quietus. After getting ready, he turned and walked out of the Ravenclaw Tower, walked around the wall outside the tower, and slowly moved towards the dark corner where the two girls were. When he was 10 steps away from the target, Scott stopped. At this time, he was a little surprised, because he did not see the target's figure, nor did he hear the target's voice. The two first-year witches actually use the disillusionment charm and the quietus charm, or similar means. If Scott's perception of magic was not beyond ordinary people, he might not easily find them when he passed by them. For a moment, Scott didn't know whether to sigh that the other party was so cautious at such a young age, or to sigh that the family education of these ancient pure-blood families was a bit advanced. But he knew that this could not be attributed to the family education of pure-blood families, because although there were not many students from pure-blood families in Hogwarts, they were not rare. Other students in the first grade were far from Travers' ability. Although he could not see the target with his eyes, Scott could clearly perceive at this distance that it was Travers who used magic. At this time, Scott could no longer move forward. Because many wizards can perceive magic within 10 steps, Scott even judged that Travers also has this ability. But Scott would not give up. He stood against the stone wall of the tower, allowing his body to merge with the stone wall, and then took out a small piece of ebony from the deformed lizard skin bag on his waist. He placed the piece of ebony in the palm of his left hand, and gently waved the wand with his right hand and pointed at the wood block. The ebony wood block immediately began to deform. Soon, a small black wooden bat appeared in his palm. Scott could use this level of basic transfiguration silently without spells. But the black bat he transformed was just a normal wood carving, a completely dead object. Scott did not stop. He first placed the tip of his wand on the back of the bat sculpture and gently drew a few symbols. The ebony wand was like a carving knife, engraving a few simple symbols on the back of the bat sculpture. Then, Scott waved his wand slightly again, and the wood grain on the bat sculpture faded immediately, and black fluff grew. Scott raised his hand gently, and the transformed object, which was exactly the same as a real bat, flew out silently. What Scott did seemed very simple, but if Professor McGonagall saw this scene, she would be shocked. Because what he did was very similar to the conjecture in Bill Weasley's paper discussed in the Transfiguration Club today. This conjecture that everyone in the club said was impossible to achieve seemed to be happening in Scott's hands. Although he divided the transfiguration in this conjecture into several steps, the effects of transfiguration and ancient magic were achieved in stages, and the content of the spell was not used. But it is still a shocking achievement. If Scott demonstrated it in front of the editor-in-chief of Transfiguration today, the other party would definitely give him the most promising newcomer award with the highest enthusiasm. But unfortunately, neither Professor McGonagall nor the editor-in-chief of Transfiguration today had the chance to see this scene. Scott would not rashly show his achievements, which he thought were just beginning. He was not even proud of what he did. This was just the reward for his persistence in studying and practicing the basic courses of transfiguration. At the moment, Scott was looking up at the bat flying away. The bat, which almost blended into the night, flew silently to the corner where the two girls were, and hung upside down in the gap between the bricks and stones above the two heads. At such a close distance, even with the existence of the whispering spell, the voices of the two girls talking could not help but be clearly transmitted to the ears of the bat. Almost at the same time, the sound of the two people talking rang in Scott's ears. "Jasmine, I'm not sure if this will involve you," Caitlin Rose said with some concern. And, you know, I asked the senior Ravenclaw students, Scott Trollope is not easy to mess with, and, plus he is friends with Roger Davis." Wow, Scott raised his eyebrows and widened his eyes. What a coincidence. The other party is talking about him. "Don't worry, Caitlin," Jasmine Travers spoke softly, with a soft quality in her voice that seemed to soothe people's hearts. But that beautiful voice was saying something completely unpleasant. Scott Trollope is just a mudblood, and this is the wizarding world. I just want to teach that arrogant mudblood a lesson. He should understand thoroughly that our affairs are not something that people like him can manage. Tisk. Scott frowned when he heard this. I didn't expect that Miss Travers was so arrogant in private. But, he didn't do anything, right? Caitlin Roll's voice became a little timid. No, he has tried to speak to him more than once while we were with Jacob. This is what he is, a mudblood offending us. Jasmine Travers' voice became softer. You said you would always help me, right, Caitlin? Yes. Yes, Jasmine. Scott heard Caitlin Roar's voice shake with clear trepidation. I will do what you say. From her tone, Scott could tell that she was trying to overcome her emotions to cater to Jasmine Travers. Very good, Caitlin. Jasmine Travers said the compliment softly. Thank you, you will always be my best friend. I am really lucky to meet you. Caitlin Roar's voice immediately became happy. You're welcome, Jasmine. We are indeed best friends. Listening to her excited voice, Scott felt that today was an eye-opener for him. Isn't this the legendary Pua? And Travers used this trick very smoothly. She already had Caitlin Roar firmly under her control. It's great. With Caitlin's help, I feel much more at ease. Jasmine Travers said beautiful words one after another, but it's getting late now, you need to have a good rest first, let's go back. Okay, be careful when you go back, Jasmine. Don't worry. When Scott heard this, he knew he had to leave. The position where he was standing at this time was the only way for the two girls to come out. If he was too close, he might be discovered. He wasn't afraid of these two little witches, but he liked the feeling of standing behind the scenes and didn't want to show off just yet. When the two girls said goodbye, he turned and walked in the other direction. Although it was a pity that he didn't hear the key information, for him, it was enough to know that the other party wanted to deal with him secretly. Afterwards, Scott silently came to a corridor near Ravenclaw Tower, stood in the shadow under the pillars, and watched two girls walking out of the dark corner behind the tower. After watching them say goodnight to each other again, Caitlin Roar stood at the gate of the tower and watched eagerly as Jasmine Travers walked towards the Slytherin common room. It wasn't until Jasmine Travers left her sight that Caitlin Roar turned around and entered the tower. But neither of them noticed that a weightless little black bat was holding tightly on the back of Jasmine Travers's sleeves with its small claws, swaying gently as she walked. Scott did not choose to go back to the common room at this time. He immediately followed Caitlin Roar at a short distance after entering the tower. His body became one with the tower and he walked silently. Little did Caitlin Roar know that the person she and Jasmine Travers wanted to deal with was following her, just a few steps away. Scott was not the type to get attacked and then fight back. On the contrary, he has always been accustomed to strike first. Scott smiled silently as he walked up the spiral staircase behind Caitlin Roar. The best way to deal with danger is of course to make the danger disappear directly, or to deal with the person who is trying to bring danger to you first. Of course, he wasn't planning on hurting anyone directly. In this magic castle, he still doesn't have the ability to escape investigation after hurting someone. Who knows how much control their great headmaster had over the castle. He just let the girl who tried to harm him, naturally, get sick for a period of time. He couldn't use spells or potions on her because that might be found out later. He would never underestimate the influence those pureblood families had on Hogwarts. Of course, the biggest reason for this is that their great principal is a very rule-abiding person. This can be seen from the original work, where the most powerful wizard of this century was repeatedly restrained by some clowns. Scott took out a small sealed glass bottle from the deformed lizard skin bag on his waist. He raised the half-finger-long transparent glass bottle to his eyes, shook it slightly, and took a closer look. A lone syringe needle lay inside the glass bottle. If you want to make someone sick, you may be found out if you use a spell or potion. But what if he's using a virus that wizards have never understood? Scott smiled again, carefully opened the sealed glass bottle and held it with his fingers. He took out the wand with his other hand and waved it gently, a little further away. With a faint fluctuation of magic power, the metal needle in the glass bottle turned into a black mosquito. This Aedes aegypti mosquito flapped its transparent wings and flew out of the glass bottle, flying straight towards Caitlin Roar above the spiral staircase. A few seconds later, Scott heard a soft scream from the other party as he wished. He stood quietly and waited until the mosquito flew back and turned into a needle again and fell into the glass bottle. He listened to Caitlin Roar's footsteps continuing up the stairs, inserted the wand into the wand holster in his arms with his backhand, sealed the glass bottle, turned and walked towards the bottom of the stairs. Next, he walked unimpeded to the Black Lake, squatted down, put the glass bottle in his hand on the ground, took out his wand and waved it again. Evanesco. The glass bottle containing the needle disappeared completely in an instant under the influence of magic, and Scott stood up. Next, while walking along the shore of the Black Lake, he calculated in his mind the approximate location of Slytherin's student dormitory below the Black Lake. 15 minutes later, he stopped again. He walked to the lake, took off one of his shoes and placed it on the water, and waved his wand to turn the shoe into a boat before it sank. It just smells a bit like feet. Scott climbed onto the boat and muttered softly, and began to shake the oars made of shoelaces. The calm and deep lake surface was rippling, and the smelly boat slowly moved forward. 5 minutes later, Scott stopped and let the boat drift on the lake. At this time, he had restored the connection with the bat that followed Jasmine Travers back to the Slytherin common room. He waved his wand without hesitation, turning his robe into an iron armor that covered his whole body. Then he used a bubble head spell, turned over and jumped into the cold lake water at night. Scott sank quickly at a very fast speed, and soon saw the warm light coming from the rows of windows in the Slytherin common room and student dormitories in the depths of the lake. The time was just right. Thanks to the complicated route in Hogwarts Castle, Jasmine Travers had just returned to the dormitory. "Jasmine, you are finally back." Scott heard the voice of a strange girl. He waved his wand again to turn the armor into a robe, and swam close to the glass window of the dormitory, hiding in the lush water plants. "I was worried about you just now. If Professor Snape knew." "Don't worry, Morgan. I won't be caught by a disgusting thing like Filch." After returning to the dormitory, Jasmine Travers' voice became normal, without the soothing softness. Scott saw another girl in the double bedroom through the glass window. Morgan Avery, Jasmine Travers' companion. At this time, the two girls in the dormitory were sitting on the edge of their respective beds. They didn't notice that a small black bat took the opportunity to crawl down from Jasmine Travers' sleeves and hide between the folds of the dark green bed curtains. Morgan Avery smiled and asked, "How is it, Jasmine? What did Caitlin say?" "She will do what I say." Jasmine Travers replied confidently. "I really love you, Jasmine." Morgan Avery chuckled. "Caitlin, that silly girl from the Roll family, thinks she is your best friend." "Ah," Jasmine Travers laughed. "I was lucky to meet Caitlin on the Hogwarts Express," she said with a happy expression. "If it hadn't been for that silly girl, I wouldn't have been able to win over those Ravenclaw purebloods." "You are indeed lucky. You just complained a little, and she volunteered to help you teach Jacob a lesson." Morgan Avery sighed. "Why haven't I met such a cute girl?" "Humph, you can only envy me." Jasmine Travers first said something in a joking tone, then suddenly stood up and walked to Morgan Avery's bed, lowering her head and looking straight at her. "But I won't let you get ahead of me, Morgan." Her voice continued to grow colder, and she stretched out her fingers to gently scratch Morgan Avery's face with her nails. "You should know that a group can only have one leader." Morgan Avery looked up at her blankly, suddenly held her hand and smiled reluctantly. "What are you talking about, Jasmine?" She was trying to force a smile. "Of course I'm joking. I don't have that idea, I just want to be by your side." Jasmine Travers looked into Morgan Avery's eyes, and it took her several seconds to look away. She held Morgan Avery's hand and sat next to her, resting her head on her shoulder. Morgan, since your grandfather has been following the Dark Lord since he was a student, and your father couldn't wait to join the Dark Lord when he was a student, can you always follow me?" "Of course I will." Morgan Avery turned her head and looked at Jasmine Travers cautiously. "We've known each other since childhood, haven't we? Before that I never knew a genius like you existed, and I have no doubt that you will achieve amazing things, Jasmine." "No, Lord Travers." "No, keep calling me Jasmine, Morgan." Jasmine Travers raised her hand again and gently stroked Morgan Avery's hair. "You are an Avery, a noble pureblood, Morgan. I will never let you kneel down and kiss the hem of my robe." Before Morgan Avery could answer, she suddenly stood up again and walked to the glass window of the bedroom. "You know, Morgan, the only things I grew up with in the Travers household were those false magical portraits and lowly house elves." Scott listened to the sound in his ears and watched the girl's beautiful face in the glass window gradually distort. "I have never been to Azkaban to see my father." Jasmine Travers' voice sounded like a sigh. "That is the price he should pay for following others. But I am different." She turned back to Morgan Avery. "I decided early on that I wanted everyone to follow me." "You will do it, Jasmine." Morgan Avery looked at Jasmine Travers and stuttered a little. I mean, you. You are very smart and very powerful. And, moreover, we are just a lower grade female student group and will not attract Dumbledore's attention." Jasmine Travers said with appreciation. "You are right, Morgan. Most wizards look down on witches. They always feel that they are stronger than witches, not to mention the play between little girls like us. Woolen cloth. Tisk tisk." As expected, Scott was amazed at this scene. Is this really an 11-year-old girl? He even suspected that the other person's immature shell contained another ambitious time traveler. But thinking of the other party's usual flawed behavior and the embarrassing Chunabu remarks just now, he quickly gave up the idea. Still too naive, Miss Travers. If you want to become a new generation of Dark Lord, you can't achieve it by forming cliques with your sisters and bullying your classmates. In the dormitory, the two girls had finished their serious topics and began to sit together and talk and laugh again. By the way, Jasmine, aren't you tired of playing with that boy Jacob? Morgan Avery smiled happily. I'm worried that if he continues, his body won't be able to hold on, and if the professors find out something by then, oh no. I go. What kind of tiger wolf talk is this? Scott couldn't help but stretch his ears. That's right. Although I only used some small curses when I taught him a lesson, problems will arise in the long run. Jasmine Travers said impatiently. Scott was relieved to hear this. He thought that boy Jacob was already gifted at the age of 11. I'm tired of playing with him, Jasmine Travers said nonchalantly. After letting him finish the task this time, don't bother with him anymore. There are many cheap mudbloods in Hogwarts now, just change a toy when the time comes. Morgan Avery clucked like a hen again. You are so mean, Jasmine. If those cheap mudbloods receive your invitation and see that there are so many beautiful girls in our group, they will definitely jump in without thinking. It doesn't matter. Jasmine Travers suddenly sank her face. Scott Trollop, I have always suspected that the mudblood must have discovered something. I can't stand the way he looks at me, he is looking down on me. This makes me feel seriously offended. Okay, don't be angry, Jasmine. Morgan Avery began to comfort her. We have already planned it. As long as things go well, I think we will definitely teach Trollop a profound lesson. Then he won't be able to be so arrogant anymore. That's right, no matter if he is a genius or not. Jasmine Travers reached out and grabbed the bed curtain tightly, her voice became a little sharp. The lowly mudblood can never look down on the noble pureblood. Scott listened to the conversation between the two calmly, and even wanted to laugh. He wanted to hear what kind of lesson these two kids planned to teach him. Then, he would let them get a lesson that they would never forget. This should make their immature minds deeply aware of the dangers of the world. You have to know that in this world, some people don't play by the rules. Scott quietly lay in the water plants at the bottom of the Black Lake, listening to the conversation between the two girls through the bat that sneaked in. Jasmine Travers' tone at this moment already had a hint of impatience. She said, soon, Trollop, the mudblood, will soon be discredited. What Ravenclaw's transfiguration genius, the mudblood should always crawl in the mud. Morgan Avery may really be a family-learned person. She has completely integrated into the role of a follower. At this time, she immediately flattered her little master skillfully. Of course, it is impossible for a mudblood to have a genius like you, Jasmine. The tone of her speech was even a little too flattering, and it was obvious that she was deeply into the role. If you ask me, this is all because Dumbledore likes to be close to muggles too much. The atmosphere in Hogwarts has become more and more corrupt. It's unbelievable that such a person can be admired as a genius. Okay, Jasmine waved her hand indifferently, don't bother with those guys who have never seen the world. If I hadn't heard the pride in her tone, I would have thought she was really calm. But in Scott's eyes, the two girls' dramas were just two children playing house. It would be great if Jasmine could teach Trollop a lesson herself. Morgan Avery said with some regret, if it were you, even if Trollop was a 4th grade student, he would definitely be defeated by your magic. I'm looking forward to it too. Scott laughed when he heard this. It's a pity that although Avery's little master is a little naive and a little second-year student, he is not that stupid. Jasmine Travers shook her head. No, Trollop is not a guy like Jacob who can be taught a lesson at will. If the opponent is him, even I will find it difficult to be silent. Morgan Avery immediately agreed. Yes, although Trollop is just a lowly mudblood, it would be more troublesome if it attracted Dumbledore's attention. Tomorrow, Jasmine Travers said, Caitlin Rowe will take action tomorrow. I will spread the news through our group as quickly as possible. Morgan Avery added excitedly. By then, the whole Hogwarts will know that Scott Trollop, a 4th-year Ravenclaw, is a hidden scumbag. At this point, she laughed again like a hen. Jasmine Travers also laughed, and the two girls were very excited. They discussed enthusiastically and even began to look forward to tomorrow. They couldn't wait to watch a good show they had planned. To be honest, Scott was a little disappointed. He thought it was some interesting scheme against him, but in the end he found that the plan the two little witches were talking about was still the same old one. It was even the same as the method used to deal with Jacob, that is, to let Caitlin Roar, who was completely pua by Jasmine Travers, use the self-torture trick to frame the target. But this time their idea went a step further, wanting to portray Scott as a pervert who wanted to take a hard line on junior female students. Unfortunately, their idea was impossible to achieve. Thanks to Scott, Caitlin Roar, the implementer of the self-torture trick, will have to lie in bed for a while starting tomorrow. Of course, even if Caitlin Roar was still intact, even if Scott knew nothing about it, he believed that he would not fall into such a trap. At this time, Scott even felt regretful. It was already the end of September, and the Scottish Highlands where Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was located had a cool climate. It seemed that there was no need for him to soak in the cold lake water at night to eavesdrop on this old-fashioned conspiracy. Thinking of this, Scott, who had not noticed it before, suddenly felt a piercing cold. He had been at the bottom of the lake for a long time. He looked at the two little witches in the glass window again, turned around and swam a little further away, and took out his wand from his arms. Ascendio. Scott cast a spell on himself, and then his body immediately rose vertically towards the lake at a very fast speed. When he emerged from the water, the boat transformed by leather shoes was still floating on the lake. He shook his wet hair, wiped his face with his hands, swam to the side of the boat and climbed up, and rowed the boat to the shore in one breath. After landing, Scott first changed his leather shoes back to their original state, and then spent some time using the heat spell to dry his clothes and hair. Finally, he put on his shoes and cast the disillusionment spell on himself again. When his body merged with the night, he walked towards Ravenclaw Tower. Scott felt that the two pure-blooded little witches should thank the protection of Hogwarts Castle. Hearing so many words of lowly mudblood through the window, if he hadn't been unable to break through the defense of the magic castle, he would have made the two girls experience an unforgettable night. However, there was no rush to teach them a lesson in one night. Scott walked briskly in the moonlight. At this moment, he and the two pure-blooded little witches were looking forward to the arrival of tomorrow. Scott bypassed the joyful hide-and-seek scene of the Weasley twins and Filch and returned to Ravenclaw Tower smoothly. When he returned to the dormitory, his three roommates had already gone to bed. Scott took off his robe quietly, found a bottle of stimulant for colds and poured it into his mouth, and rushed into the bathroom with his pajamas before steam came out of his ears. As the hot water from the shower head poured over his body, Scott's ears began to spray steam. After taking a hot shower and changing into dry pajamas, Scott felt much more comfortable. The side effects of the stimulant usually last for several hours, so Scott fell asleep while steaming. A new day, the morning of Ravenclaw College fell into chaos. A first-year female student just wanted to remind her roommate Caitlin Rowe to get up, but she was greatly frightened after pulling open the bed curtain. Then, the first-year female student's very penetrating scream completely alarmed everyone in Ravenclaw College. When Eva Taylor, the fifth-year head girl of Ravenclaw, used the levitation spell to take Caitlin Rowe out of the dormitory, everyone in the common room saw her miserable state. "Oh, Merlin! Oh my God!" For a while, exclamations came one after another. "Please make way." Penelope, the sixth-grade female prefect, also came over. "We need to send poor Miss Rawle to the school infirmary." Scott was standing on the stairs leading to the dormitory from the common room, looking down at the messy scene. Caitlin Rawle, who was floating in the air, was breathing weakly at this time, and all her exposed skin was covered with dense rashes and countless blood spots. She looked so scary that other students dared not approach her, and even the two female prefects who had to take her to the school infirmary wanted to stay away. After Caitlin Rowe was taken away, the students who were watching returned to the dormitory. "What on earth is going on?" Eddie was obviously a little excited. "Do you think that Rowe's roommate cast a curse on her while she was asleep? Or put some poison in her water cup?" Roger, who was walking in front, turned his head and glared at him. "Don't guess, Eddie. Such nonsense will damage the reputation of Ravenclaw." Eddie immediately shrank his neck. "Poor Rowe, I really hope she will be fine soon." Milton sighed with a pale face. Don't worry, Madame Pomfrey will cure her soon. Scott comforted casually. Of course, only he knew that it was impossible. Afterwards, the roommates who were awakened by the screams just now went to the bathroom, while Scott, who had finished washing, returned to the dormitory to get a few books, and walked down the stairs again to the common room. Good morning, Scott. Luna's voice was still erratic. She was standing in front of a window, looking at the black lake in the distance through the glass window. When Scott passed by her, she turned around and took the initiative to say hello. Good morning, Luna. Scott smiled at her. Luna stared at Scott with her big silver eyes. You seem to be in a good mood today. Scott stopped, looked at her inquiringly, and asked her curiously, can you see my emotions? What? Luna tilted her head. Looking at her confused expression, Scott shook his head again. It's okay, I'm leaving first, Luna, goodbye. Goodbye. Luna waved. Scott walked out of the common room and trotted down the spiral staircase. After leaving the Ravenclaw Tower, he walked through the corridor and climbed to the second floor of the castle. The Hogwarts hospital is on the side of this floor. Scott did not try to get close to the hospital, but after walking through several corridors, he stuffed a small object into the brick cracks on the wall of a corridor, then turned into another corridor and pushed open the door of an abandoned classroom at the end. Because the process of being sent to the hospital was quite noisy, Scott believed that the news that Caitlin Roll had a strange disease had spread throughout Hogwarts. He felt that if Jasmine Travers and Morgan ever heard the news, they would definitely choose to go to the school hospital. And they came out of the Slytherin common room and went to the school hospital. The corridor on the side of this classroom was a must-go route. Scott closed the door of this classroom, turned around and walked to the window and opened it. He took out a piece of ebony from the lizard skin bag on his waist and performed the compound transformation spell again. But this time he did not choose a bat, but turned the ebony into a sparrow. The sparrow flew out of the open window and stayed on the windowsill of a window outside the castle that could see the corridor on the side of the classroom. Scott retracted his sight and took out 2 small glass bottles from the leather bag again. After turning the 2 needles into Aedes aegypti again, Scott let the 2 mosquitoes stay in the glass bottle temporarily. After waiting for 20 minutes, Scott's hearing connected to the sparrow heard footsteps coming from the corridor on the side. He immediately waved his wand towards himself, chanted a spell and cast a super-sensory spell. Soon, with the help of the spell, he sensed the magic in the side corridor. Unfortunately, it was not Jasmine Travers and Morgan Avery. Scott sighed silently. If he had changed to another place, he would not have had to go through so much trouble. As a magic castle that has lasted for thousands of years, the magic contained in Hogwarts is too huge and complex, and these magics will seriously interfere with Scott's perception of magic. In order not to expose himself, he can only use such a troublesome and stupid method. 10 minutes later, footsteps came to his ears again. Super-sensory. Scott cast a super-sensory spell on himself again, and then slowly raised the corners of his lips. The target appeared. He waved his wand, and 2 mosquitoes immediately flew out of the glass bottle and flew out from the gap under the classroom door. Scott stood there without moving. In his perception, 2 small mosquitoes crossed a corridor and chased after Jasmine Travers and Morgan Avery. After approaching the 2 girls, the mosquitoes slowed down and the buzzing sound was reduced. Finally, the 2 mosquitoes separated and flew down, landing on the ankles of the 2 girls and biting them lightly. The ankles were chosen because it was the most inconvenient place to swat. The target had to bend down if they wanted to swat. So, when the 2 girls felt a slight pain and bent down, the 2 mosquitoes had already flown to the wall beside them and got into the cracks in the bricks. And then, the small mechanism Scott had put in the cracks in the bricks was knocked open by the mosquitoes, and several real blood-sucking midges flew out of it. At this distance, neither Scott himself nor the sparrow outside the window could hear the conversation between the 2 girls. He just sensed that they were so angry that they cast several spells on the blood-sucking midges before leaving angrily. Scott stood in the abandoned classroom and waited until the 2 mosquitoes flew back again, turned into needles and fell into the glass bottle. Vanished without a trace. Scott waved his wand and was once again satisfied with the vanishing spell that was most suitable for destroying evidence. Then, he used the same method to deal with the sparrow and the small mechanism in the brick joints of the corridor wall. After the morning class, Scott and his roommates had lunch together. After lunch, they returned to Ravenclaw Tower, only to find that the students were blocking the door of the common room. What happened? Scott asked a couple of the same grade next to him. Professor Flitwick and Madame Pomfrey are checking Miss Rowe's dormitory, Dylan Kingwell said. His girlfriend Kayla White said, maybe they should check our common room too. The girl's face was a little pale, obviously frightened. It's terrible. Did you see how Caitlin looked this morning? She held Dylan's hand tightly, as if trying to draw some strength. I heard that Madame Pomfrey judged that it was a strange disease that had never been seen before, not caused by a curse or potion. Because there is no targeted potion for this strange disease, she can only temporarily control Caitlin's condition. She is trying to find the cause of Caitlin's illness in the dormitory. Don't worry, Kira, Dylan whispered to comfort her, the professors will definitely find a way. But Kira was still worried. We don't know whether this terrible strange disease is contagious. Soon, Professor Flitwick and Madame Pomfrey came out of the common room. No, nothing that makes people sick was found. Madame Pomfrey looked a little discouraged. I'm sorry, Phileas, maybe we should send the child to St. Mungo's as soon as possible. Let's go find Dumbledore. Professor Flitwick's face was not good either, and the two hurried away. Next, the student's strange disease soon alarmed the family, and Caitlin Rowe's parents quickly rushed to the school and took her to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Injuries and Diseases. But things don't seem to be over. In the afternoon, 2 first-year Slytherin girls fell into a coma in class, and then showed the same symptoms as Caitlin Rowe. That afternoon, in the first-year potion class, 2 Slytherin girls fell ill one after another, which completely shocked Hogwarts. According to the first-year students who were in the class, if Professor Snape had not used magic quickly, the 2 girls might have fallen into the crucible filled with boiling scabies water. Not to mention the magical thing that how 2 girls could squeeze into a crucible, the students of Hogwarts are always used to exaggerating everything they see as much as possible. In short, after Madame Pomfrey confirmed that the symptoms of the 2 girls were almost the same as those of Caitlin Rowe, they were immediately sent to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Injuries and Maladies by the professors without hesitation. At the same time, the panic that could be seen with the naked eye quickly spread throughout Hogwarts. The students were all rumored that they believed that there was an unprecedented horrible infectious disease that was raging in Hogwarts, and no one knew who would be the next unlucky person to be infected. Under such circumstances, many students could not sit still. They sent owls to their families, hoping that their parents and family would take them home from school. At this time, Scott was walking alone in a chaotic castle. He knew that the professors would soon take action to control the disorder in the school, but he had to take advantage of the chaos to do something to completely eliminate the hidden dangers. In a corridor leading to the basement of the castle, 3 worried Slytherin students hurried past. I have written to my father. He will definitely take me home as soon as possible. Draco Malfoy, who covered his face with a dark green scarf, said loudly. My father will do the same. And my father. His 2 followers immediately echoed loudly. They are Gregory Goyle and Vincent Crabbe, 2 boys who look like they are closely related to trolls. At this time, their image is more exaggerated than Malfoy's. The dark green scarves tightly wrapped their big heads, revealing only their eyes squeezed into slits by fat. The 3 Slytherin boys were all in a panic. They didn't notice that Scott, who was also walking hurriedly, disappeared completely after passing a thick column not far away. Hurry up, Crabbe, Goyle. Malfoy quickened his pace. Next we must stay quietly in the common room and wait for our father to pick us up. The 3 boys began to run. Using the disillusionment charm to hide his figure, Scott followed them slowly all the way underground and finally came to the door of the Slytherin common room. Scott leaned against the wall beside him and watched the 3 boys shout out the command to open the door. At this point, he had reconnected with the bat that stayed in Travers' dormitory last night, but it was not enough for him to command the bat to move. After Malfoy and the other 2 entered the common room, Scott gently took out his wand and waved it slightly. Super Sense. With the help of the Super Sense charm, Scott sensed that the bat hanging in the folds of the bed curtain in the dormitory had moved. It flapped its wings and flew up in the empty dormitory, passing through the owl passage hidden in the ceiling and flew to the outside of the common room. Disappear without a trace. Scott raised his wand and cast a vanishing spell on the bat, then turned and left immediately. With the help of the extrasensory spell, he had sensed that Snape's magic was coming here. Thanks to the intricate passages in Hogwarts Castle, Scott quickly walked into the winding passages in the dungeon on the other side, avoiding the possibility of meeting Snape in advance. But when Scott finally returned to the Ravenclaw common room again, he was caught by Professor Flitwick. "Oh, where have you been, Scott?" Professor Flitwick looked a little haggard, and the anxious expression on his face had not yet dissipated, but he was immediately relieved when he saw him. "Sorry, Professor." Scott saw Professor Flitwick's look, and some guilt surged in his heart. "You shouldn't run around at this time." Flitwick criticized him a few words, but did not delve into the question of where he went. "Dumbledore has taken this matter seriously. The professors will investigate it thoroughly today. You just stay in the dormitory and don't go out. I have already notified the prefects." He hurriedly said a few more words and left. Scott could feel Professor Flitwick's trust in him, which made him feel a little more guilty. But it was just guilt, he would not regret it. Scott looked around. There were not many people gathered in the Ravenclaw common room at this time. Obviously, most students hid in the dormitory. He saw the couple Dylan and Kira. Kira was sobbing on the sofa, and Dylan squatted in front of her and held her hand. "Don't worry, Kira." Dylan comforted his girlfriend softly. "So far, only 3 people have shown symptoms. This may not be an infectious disease." "No, this is an infectious disease, just like I said at noon." Kira was already scared. She never knew that she had the talent of prophecy. Scott passed by the couple. Of course, he would not use a widespread infectious virus. Scott returned to his dormitory via the stairs behind the statue of Rowena Ravenclaw, the founder of the house. He pushed open the bedroom door, and Milton immediately stood up to greet him. "You're back, Scott. I was worried, but Roger said there was no need to look for you." Although Scott was used to Milton's sentimental character, he was still startled by his red eyes. "I'm fine, Milton, thank you." He thanked him in a dry tone. "As long as you're okay." Milton smiled and sighed in a low voice. "If something like this happens, what will happen to Hogwarts?" "Don't worry, Milton. It will be fine. Our Principal Dumbledore and Professor Flitwick are fully capable of solving these matters," Roger said. He was lying on the bed with one leg crossed and flipping through a Quidditch magazine. Unlike Milton, he still maintained an optimistic view of the current situation. Eddie, another member of the dormitory, was sorting through his pile of bottles and jars of merchandise. "I think it's a good thing," he said. Facing the eyes of others gathered on him, Eddie continued, "We all know that those 3 girls are usually close to each other. No matter what the reason for their collapse, the same symptoms mean a lot." Scott understood what he meant. "You are saying that as long as the professors work hard to thoroughly investigate the cause of their illness, the group of pure-blooded little witches organized by Travers will be completely exposed to them." "That's right," Eddie said with a smile. "Then we won't have to spend our energy keeping an eye on a group of lower-grade female students." At night, Scott lay in bed and carefully thought about what he had done in the past 2 days. After confirming again that there were no mistakes, he breathed a sigh of relief. Of course, although he believed that he would not be found out, he was not 100% relieved. After all, this is Hogwarts, and their headmaster is Dumbledore. He couldn't use his shallow experience in magic for only 3 years to speculate on the old man who was known as the most powerful wizard in this century. But Scott was also curious about something. How would Dumbledore react if he knew all the little things Jasmine Travers did after she entered school? Jasmine Travers was born into a pure-blood family loyal to the Dark Lord. Her father is a notorious Death Eater and is still imprisoned in Azkaban. It can be said that she has a family background. Also, as a daughter, Travers is much more promising than her father. She is not satisfied with her father crawling at the feet of the Dark Lord. She wants to become the new generation of Dark Lord herself. Such a pity. Scott regretted that he could not see Principal Dumbledore's expression. He also wanted to know if Dumbledore would become as defensive with a little girl as he was with Tom Riddle in the originals. However, he felt that the so-called pure-blood witch group had no future, and the professors who knew the truth would definitely keep a close eye on these pure-blood little witches. However, all this is just his guess and cannot be done accurately. He can just wait for the result with peace of mind. At breakfast time the next day, when Scott and his roommates came to the auditorium, they found that all the professors were sitting on the teacher's bench, including their principal Dumbledore. Dumbledore may have news to announce to us, Eddie whispered excitedly. He must have found the reason for the illness of those 3 girls. I guess they have even cured them. Scott was noncommittal about Eddie's words. If what caused the illness of the 3 girls was magic, he believed that Dumbledore could solve it quickly. But regarding the virus he brought from the Muggle world, wizards who have always been arrogant towards Muggles would not think that way. So he guessed that there was only one treatment method that wizards could use, to use potions or spells to enhance their physique and rely on their own immunity to defeat the virus in their bodies. Therefore, the 3 girls cannot be discharged from the hospital in a short time. As time passed, students came to the auditorium one after another. All the little wizards were sitting on the long table in their academy and whispering. It seemed that Dumbledore's appearance had driven away the panic, and the students were generally much calmer than yesterday. This is Dumbledore's intimidation. As long as he is here, people will feel at ease. Ding, ding, ding. Professor McGonagall tapped the glass 3 times with her silver spoon. Quiet. With a stern glance, the huge auditorium immediately fell silent. Cough. Dumbledore coughed and was about to speak when Lockhart, who was sitting on the teacher's bench, suddenly stood up. Hello everyone. Lockhart grinned, showing his neat white teeth. I see that many young wizards are not in good spirits. This makes me, the most popular professor at Hogwarts, Professor Lockhart, deeply saddened. Lockhart was still wearing a brightly colored robe, holding his head high and looking confident. Scott noticed that at this time, the other professors on the teacher's bench were looking at Lockhart, who suddenly jumped out with indescribable eyes. Professor Snape, in particular, looked at Lockhart like a flobber caterpillar. His face was also very ugly, like the reaction of seeing 100 Harry Potters smiling at him. Professor McGonagall kept winking at Principal Dumbledore, but Dumbledore hesitated to speak. For some reason, he did not stop Lockhart from speaking. I know you are worried about what happened yesterday, but you seem to have forgotten that you don't actually need to worry. Lockhart didn't notice the other professor's reactions at all. He was performing enthusiastically. I, Gilderoy Lockhart, Order of Merlin 3rd Class, honorary member of the Defense League Against the Dark Arts, 5-time winner of Wizarding Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, but I don't talk about that. I'm not use your smile to drive away female ghosts. He repeated his classic lines again, then raised his head high, as if waiting for the students' reaction. However, he was disappointed. No one screamed or laughed. Even his most ardent admirers were not in the mood to cheer for him at this time. He is such a big idiot. Roger cursed in a low voice, that idiot who can only giggle. Doesn't he know that everyone is waiting for Dumbledore to tell us the result? No one responded, but Lockhart, who was standing at the teacher's desk, felt no embarrassment at all. Okay, I know you're in a bad mood. He sighed pretentiously, but you shouldn't forget that there happens to be a Defense Against Dark Arts expert in the school at the moment. He spread his hands helplessly. Yes, I'm still here. What do you have to worry about? At this point, he giggled again. Don't worry, little wizards, this matter will be solved soon, I promise you. Very well, thank you Professor Lockhart for your remarks. Dumbledore finally stood up, clapped lightly, nodded to Lockhart, and motioned for him to sit down. Lockhart's smile was interrupted for a moment, and he saluted Dumbledore in a casual manner. When he raised his head again, the smile on his face returned to normal. I know everyone is very concerned about what happened yesterday. When Dumbledore began his speech, all the students in the hall were listening carefully. Our Miss Roll, Miss Avery, and Miss Travert were infected with diseases for unknown reasons and were eventually sent to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. Dumbledore spoke a little slowly, and the anxious students couldn't help but stretch their necks. Unfortunately, we have never found the cause of their illness, and we have not yet developed a targeted treatment plan. Hearing this, many students showed some panic on their faces again. Dumbledore continued, but fortunately, none of the 3 young ladies are in danger of death. According to the estimate of the therapists at St. Mungo's, they will recover in 3 months with conservative treatment. We will welcome them back to school at that time. I see. Thank you Merlin. Tears welled up in Milton's eyes again. I thought. That's great. It turns out that it is not a fatal disease. At this time, many students were cheering. Until Professor McGonagall knocked on the glass again. Although it is not too bad news, don't forget that we still haven't found the cause. Dumbledore pressed his hands down. I still hope that students will remain vigilant. If anyone finds relevant clues, you are welcome to come to me or other professors. I believe that no matter whether I or other professors, I will not be stingy to give him extra points. Finally, I want to emphasize one point. Dumbledore said to the students, although we don't know the specific cause of the illness of those 3 students, after testing by the therapists at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Maladies, this disease is not it can be transmitted from person to person. Of course, Scott thought. If the virus could spread from person to person, it would cause a huge stir and attract more people's attention, which was inconsistent with his expectations. Now, who would have thought that this was a Muggle virus that could only be spread by certain species of mosquitoes? At this time, the students all had smiles on their faces when they heard the conclusion that it would not spread from person to person. Just when they were about to cheer again, Dumbledore issued another warning. This means that we have not found the specific transmission route of this disease. So I think students should still remain vigilant. The students who wanted to jump up and cheer just now were quiet, and their high emotions immediately fell into silence. Next, we will do our best to prevent the disease from reappearing. Dumbledore smiled reassuringly at the students again. First of all, our respected head nurse, Madame Pomfrey, and your potions professor, Professor Snape, will conduct research on this disease. I believe they will soon be able to invent targeted treatments and magic spells, medicine. At this time, Madame Pomfrey and Professor Snape both nodded. Very good, I believe in their ability. Dumbledore encouraged the 2 of them and continued. Next, our castle administrator Mr. Filch and our gamekeeper Mr. Hagrid will clean up Hogwarts Castle and the surrounding area, dealing with small animals like bugs and mice that can spread diseases. Dumbledore methodically made arrangements for cleaning up the campus, but Scott didn't listen anymore. As the instigator of this incident, he certainly wouldn't worry about any illness. On the contrary, for him, most of the dangers to him have been successfully eliminated, except for one last thing. Scott turned his head and looked at Jacob Kent, who was sitting at the end of the long table. He still remembered that Jasmine Travers once said, "Let him finish that thing," but he didn't know what she asked Jacob to do, and whether this kid would do it now. As if sensing Scott's gaze, Jacob, who had been lowering his head just now, raised his head and met Scott's eyes. Scott raised the corners of his mouth slightly and gave Jacob a subtle smile. Jacob's eyes flickered and he lowered his head again. Scott stared at him for a few more seconds before looking away. Unfortunately, for this boy, he couldn't make any more moves. After all, walking will leave traces, and the more you do, the more likely you are to be exposed. But Scott is not worried. He can see many things from a wizard's magical state. Jacob is undoubtedly a smart man. At this point, he should not dare to do anything else. When Dumbledore's speech ended, Scott and the others finally had breakfast. After breakfast, the other 3 deans except Professor McGonagall called away some students from their own colleges. Although the name is that they have been in close contact with 3 patients recently and need to check their health. But Scott keenly noticed that most of the students who were called away were young witches in the lower grades. Sure enough, the professors had discovered Travers' small group. Scott's roommates also discovered this fact. Let me just say it. Eddie winked at Scott and the others, showing a proud expression. The 3 Scotts ignored him. They separated from Eddie and came to the potions classroom located underground in the castle. Ravenclaw still takes this potions class with Hufflepuff. The students sat in groups as usual. Since Professor Snape hadn't arrived yet, everyone was discussing Dumbledore's morning speech enthusiastically. Scott and Milton sit together. Roger didn't know when he met another Hufflepuff female student. They sat in the front row of Scott and Milton and whispered together. Roger's ex-girlfriend, Miss Mill, who was sitting on the other side, kept turning her head to glare at the 2 of them. What we are trying to prepare today should be an antidote. Milton opened the textbook. I have to read the steps again. I remember you have previewed it 3 times, Milton. Scott was busy putting the potion-making tools in a convenient place. Milton didn't even raise his head. No, every time Professor Snape stands next to me, I will lose my memory and forget what to do next. I think this has nothing to do with memory, Scott said helplessly. You are just too nervous. Don't worry about Professor Snape, remember that we are a group, I will give you tips. Milton glanced at him gratefully. Oh, thank you, Scott. But I still have to look at it again. Scott had nothing to say. Because it happens every time. Whenever he was paired up with Milton in potions class, Scott always had to come to the rescue. Because Snape would always slide around the classroom, staring at every student with a sullen face. It is difficult for students with poor psychological quality not to make mistakes under his watch. For example, Milton. Whenever someone made a mistake, Snape would curl up his upper lip and start spewing venom in his unique accent, which would often make the student who made the mistake even more panicked. And students who make mistakes again will definitely be deducted points by Snape. Scott seriously suspected that Snape was deliberately looking for opportunities in this way to deduct all the points of the other 3 colleges except Slytherin. By the way, Milton was one of Snape's important targets in class. However, because Scott always saved the situation in time, Snape rarely deducted points from Milton. Scott felt that this was the reason why Snape was unhappy with him. As for Scott's own potion results, it can only be said that it was neither good nor bad. He was just able to strictly follow the steps in the textbook. Rigid. No creativity. This was Snape's evaluation of him. Scott always didn't care. He didn't want to study and develop in depth in the field of potions, and he didn't have such high requirements for himself. He felt that it was enough for him to succeed in making it according to the existing formula. Quiet. Snape suddenly pushed open the door of the classroom and strode towards the podium. His wide black robe rolled like a ball of black smoke. Open your textbooks. His dark and empty eyes swept across the classroom, and all the students lowered their heads. No one wanted to look at him. Antidote. I think you should have reviewed the contents of the textbook. He said. Now, each group sends a student to take your potion materials. Upon hearing Professor Snape's order, the students immediately started to move. All go. Scott stood up on his own initiative. Okay. Milton smiled sheepishly. Sorry to trouble you, Scott. Scott knew that he didn't want to be near Snape unless he had to. Scott walked to the cabinet next to the classroom and started to get the potion materials to be used. The students around them were also in an orderly manner, and there was no such thing as panic because they didn't know what materials to get. After all, everyone is already in their 4th year, and Snape will no longer take the opportunity to deduct points for this kind of thing. When everyone returned to their seats after collecting the materials, Snape took out his wand and waved it, and writing appeared on the blackboard behind him. Very good, he said. Now, follow the steps on the blackboard and start making it. Scott and Milton quickly looked up at the blackboard and used quills to mark the differences between the content on the blackboard and the textbook. A true potion master will always optimize the production of various potions. 4th-year students have learned from countless lessons in the past that they must rely on Snape's blackboard writing in potions class. Scott reviewed the process of making the antidote potion again, discussed it with Milton for a few words, and the two began to work separately on the potion materials. At this time, Snape also started to take action. He walked around the classroom silently, stopping from time to stare at the students' movements with oppressive eyes. Whenever Snape came next to Scott and the others, Milton began to flinch, not even daring to breathe. At this time, Scott had to allocate part of his energy to prevent him from making mistakes and panic. Fortunately, this is not the first time Milton has experienced this kind of battle, and he already has experience in dealing with it. Although he is still not immune to Snape's interference, he will stop whenever he feels that his thinking is unclear. In this way, although the speed is slower, he will not make mistakes easily. During this class, Snape passed by Milton several times, and once even deliberately got very close to stare at his movements. Scott quickly took over Milton's work before his hands shook. This seemed to disappoint Snape, and Scott heard him exhale heavily from his nose before turning and walking away. But not everyone in this class escaped like Milton. Several Hufflepuff students made mistakes in the process of making potions, allowing Snape to dunk Hufflepuff as he wished. 5 points. Especially Roger's ex-girlfriend Miss Mill. Her attention was probably given to Roger and his new potions partner. Anyway, she kept making mistakes during this class, and at the end there was even smoke coming out of her cauldron. So Hufflepuff was deducted 5 more points for Miss Mill's mistake. Fortunately, Hufflepuff students never pay much attention to house points. On the way after class, they quickly became happy again. Instead, it was Milton, who still looked like he was about to survive a disaster after walking out of the potions classroom. Scott patted him on the shoulder and said to him, "Hey, it's over. We got an A acceptable pass for the potion. Now let's forget about the antidote and go to the history of magic class. Take a good rest." "Oh yes, history of magic." Milton came to his senses, put the magic potions and potions in his hand into the school bag he carried with him, and took out another history of magic. "I love history of magic." Milton immediately became visibly happy and held the thick book in his arms. "I knew it," Scott thought. Milton was probably the only student in the history of magic class who listened with gusto. Although the tone of Professor Spencer's lectures as a ghost makes people fall asleep, Milton is very good at making up many romantic and beautiful stories from the boring history. He once gained a lot of inspiration from this and even wrote more than 30 cello pieces with the theme of historical stories. Ravenclaw was taking this history of magic class with Slytherin, so Roger hurried into the classroom alone before class. "You didn't even bring your textbooks." Scott looked at the book, Magic Potions and Potions, in his hand. "Is this guy a little too arrogant? Copied in pairs, Geminio." Roger took out his wand and made a copy of Scott's textbook, smiling proudly. "By the way," he leaned closer and whispered, "we are going to test a new formation this afternoon. Do you and Milton want to come and take a look?" "New formation? I remember the team changed seekers before," Scott asked. "Yes, choose level is not bad," Roger said. "To be honest, he is better than Carson." Carson, who was in 7th grade, was Ravenclaw's former seeker. Because he was about to graduate and had never performed well in the team, he simply gave up the seeker position to Chu Jong this time. "Want to take a look? Maybe you can give us some advice," Roger said to Scott and Milton. Both Scott and Milton were somewhat interested in the team's new formation and new members, so they readily agreed. "I'll go," Scott said. "I only have one arithmancy class in the afternoon." "I'm in the divination class," Milton said. In the afternoon, Scott left the arithmetic divination classroom and went back to his dormitory first. By the time he arrived at the Quidditch pitch, Milton was already sitting in the stands. "Did you come here directly after class?" Scott asked casually when he saw that he was still carrying a school bag. "Yes, the atmosphere of the divination class today is a bit heavy." Milton seemed a little uneasy. "I wanted to come here early to relax." "What did Professor Trelawney predict again?" Scott asked habitually. "She said." Milton swallowed and began to imitate Professor Trelawney's strange voice. "The shadow has shrouded Hogwarts, and someone will encounter misfortune after Halloween." It seems quite accurate, if it is about the original plot of the Chamber of Secrets. "You should be used to it," Scott said to Milton. "Professor Trelawney often makes some sensational predictions." "I hope nothing will happen." Milton was still a little worried. "Nothing will happen," Scott said, "because he has decided to kill the danger in advance. If his plan goes well at that time, the victim will only be a cat." While the two were talking, the team members flew out of the locker room next to the court on flying broomsticks. They first flew around the court for a few laps, and Roger kept waving at Scott and Milton. "No." Scott narrowed his eyes, suddenly stood up, and took out his wand. Milton saw that he looked serious and asked, "What's wrong?" "Sonorous." Scott put his wand against his throat. "Roger." His voice instantly spread throughout the court. "Jump down immediately. There's something wrong with your broom." Out of long-standing trust and tacit understanding, Roger immediately turned over and jumped off the flying broom without hesitation. Wingardium Leviosa. Scott raised his wand and cast a perfect floating spell on the falling Roger, stopping him in midair. At this moment, Roger's flying broom began to spin in the air, and even emitted black smoke. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.